Welcome everybody on behalf of our team here at the Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities. We are proud to be here presenting this project funded by the California Department of Education in collaboration with CCEE, the California Collaborative of Educational Excellence, and Imperial County SELPA. We are happy to have you here and want to welcome every single one of you. You'll notice that in the chat section, we'll be dropping links for the Padlet, activities, and/or resources as they pop up. So again, I want to welcome you. My name is Vanessa Lopez. I'm a coordinator here at Imperial County SELPA. Together, Lupita, Debbie, and myself, we are part of the Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities SELPA Content Lead Team. And the entire team is here today, so we're excited to be connecting with you today. You will find our contact information on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to us using either the telephone or the email on the screen, and we love connecting with you. You'll also notice that in these first couple of slides, you're going to see a link to the Padlet. Know that this Padlet has today's slides, as well as additional resources that we'll be referencing throughout the day. We'll be posting that continuously as we spend time together this morning. So before we get started, I introduced myself and our team. Now I want to know a little bit about you. We're going to launch a poll. And in the meantime, please go ahead and use the rename feature by clicking on the 3 dots by your tile. Add your name, your district, and your position. If you are unable to do it that route, you may use the chat feature to share with us your name, district, and position. We love to know where our participants hail from as we come together in these statewide sessions. So as the poll launches, complete the poll and then give us more detail using the chat feature. Give you a couple of seconds to do that. And by the way, we're here in El Centro, California. If we're sharing where we're from in the state, we're right in the corner where Mexico and Arizona meets, just to give you a geographical idea of where it is that Imperial County SELPA is located. We're always curious to find out who our practitioners are present in our sessions today, from the special education side of the house, general education side of the house, teachers, administrators, speech pathologists, school psychologists, all of our collectively committed practitioners in the field to improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. Again, once more, welcome, every single one of you, welcome. So as we are looking at our daily schedule, I want to give you upfront information for you to plan your day. I know that some of us are still working from home or have other things to attend to through the day, so it's always important to let you know what the structure of the day is going to look like. So our start time ideally was 8:30, but we're going to continue with the breaks as planned. At 9:30, we'll take a break. 10:30, we'll take another one. 11:30, lunch. At 1:30, there'll be another break for you, and then at 2:30 in the afternoon, if appropriate, or if not, we might just go all the way through in the afternoon. But again, plan for these to take place. That way you can plan your day and take care of yourself. We know that Zoom fatigue is real, and we want to give you a break away from your screens as we spend time together so that you will be able to process some of this information, remove yourself from the screen, and give your brain a break. We need that. It's an important part of our learning as well. So again, resources. Feel free to snap a pic of the QR code, save it, or click on the link, or use the bit.ly above. You can find today's slide deck and additional resources referenced in today's presentation within that same Padlet. And as always, all of our resources are free, and you can remake and share as you see fit. You can also remake the Padlet, add or delete resources as it fits your needs based on the role that you fulfill at your school site, LEA, COE, whatever your position may be. And as I mentioned, we are part of the ONE system in the California System of Support. We are a SELPA content area lead in the area of English learners with disabilities. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in that little corner where Mexico, Arizona, and California meet. We are part of the system and we are here to support. We want to connect, collaborate, and facilitate conversations around all things English learners with disabilities. If you want to learn more about our role within the California System of Support, we have a one-page document that gives you some information as far as to what the work we do entails. You can find this linked in the Padlet and also by clicking on the document itself on the slide deck. This will give you additional information and resources that will link you back into our website so that you can access infographics, Padlets, videos, training modules, and future opportunities for you to connect with all of us. So before we get started, it's important to ground ourselves as to our why. Given your respective role in your school site, in your COE, LEA, it is important for us to know what our purpose is, what is our motivation, what it is that we believe. Then we also have to be aware of our how, our process. What specific actions are we taking or want to take to realize our why? And then finally, the what, that result. What do you do? The result of that why. So again, as we center ourselves in this conversation, in this space and time, please keep this in mind. Given your respective role, your why, the how, and the what. Keeping that in mind as we engage in today's conversation specific to the pre-referral process of English learners and English learners who may meet eligibility criteria for disabilities, it is important for us to know all of these elements or at least have an idea of them as we connect and engage. Should you wish to do so, go ahead and share in the chat what your purpose is, what your process is, and what you hope your result to be. It is always important for us to be informed by voices in the field so that we can then also help structure our understanding and perhaps additional areas of need as they arise. So again, given that this is session 2 from a statewide series, a 5-part series, we are going to start every single section also with our why. So our why is to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. And we know that English learners are students of a national origin minority who are limited in English language proficiency. So again, this is an acronym, ELLs. We know that education is full of acronyms. And this is a term used to refer to students whose home or native language is a language other than English and who are in the process of learning academic English. When we talk about SWD, students with a disability, we're talking about a student who has been formally identified as having a disability meeting eligibility criteria in one or more of the 13 distinct disability categories as IDEA indicates. So if we look at that graphic, we see that out of all of the students with disabilities, we have around 28% who are English learners with disabilities in the state of California. So it's important to have our why be informed, and this truly informs our why. There is a need because we know that these aren't just numbers. These are individuals. These are students with specific needs who we are aiming to support in their acquisition, not just of their English language, but also in making meaningful academic progress. So as always, our grounding document is the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. So the Department of Education developed the California Practitioner's Guide to provide information specific to identification, assessment, support, and reclassification of English learners who may qualify or who have qualified for special education, and the provision of services to students with disabilities who are also English learners. So this manual, this guide, is going to assist all practitioners and leaders in developing and implementing policies and practices related to English learners with disabilities. And always, 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 whenever we reference a document, a form, an appendix, a table, know that we have linked it directly into the practitioner's guide or to our website where you can access these resources that are born from the California Practitioner's Guide. And again, feel free to peruse the document and to access it, whether it be through the links in the Padlet or by visiting CDE or our own website. And again, always noting that the guidance provided in the practitioner's guide is not binding on local educational agencies except for the statutes, regulations, court decisions, and then any other referenced herein within the document. So before we get started, we're just going to briefly set the context. So from the policy context section of the practitioner's guide, we singled out specific dates that give us an idea as to where the California Practitioner's Guide place is in this timeline, right? This context as we move forward to help meet the needs of students with disabilities who are English learners. So we have the development of the ELD standards and the framework, the curriculum frameworks, and then the statewide task force from special education that gave a report on concerns about siloing and emphasizing a need for collaboration for all students. Then in 2015, we see the arrival of the California multi-tiered systems of support, and again, continuing this timeline across the development of the dyslexia guidelines, Prop 58, the wonderful resources and references within the EL roadmap. The LPAC is then introduced, the California statewide system of support is established, and then finally in 2019, July of 2019, the California Department of Education develops the Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, which was a highly collaborative process involving a team of writers, reviewers, CDE staff, researchers, administrators, state and LEA staff, and practitioners. So again, we wanted to make sure that all these groups of individuals, this multidisciplinary team, came together to ensure accuracy, relevance, and practicality. So we're going to be looking specifically today at Section 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide. Section 2 is inclusive of 2 chapters, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. And these 2 chapters deal with all things related to pre-referral, referral, assessment, and the IEP process. To give you an idea on how the day is going to be structured, this morning we're going to be looking specifically at Chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with special education referral process for English learners, okay? So this is the referral process for English learners. Every chapter begins with grounding questions, and these questions are organized into 2 sections, for teachers and for administrators. So for teachers, some of the questions that are addressed in this chapter is, what pre-referral steps should be documented to ensure that a special education referral for an English learner is appropriate? Additionally, what information do I need from parents to help determine if a referral to special education is in fact appropriate? Finally, from the teacher standpoint, what data do I need to collect to ensure that the referral is appropriate? Now, from the administrator's lens, Chapter 3 helps answer questions such as, what is the process to ensure that special education referral for English learners is appropriate and does not lead to over or under identification of English learners for special education services? And finally, how do I ensure that I meet the state and federal child find requirements for English learners? As a team, we've developed a couple of resources to support your access to Chapter 3. One of the resources developed is one you see screenshotted here into this slide, and this is a Chapter 3 infographic. The Chapter 3 infographic is meant to be used in tandem with the California Practitioner's Guide. We've taken the content of the Practitioner's Guide, Chapter 3, and broken it up visually, linking you back into the actual document should you want additional information on some of the bulleted points listed out. Know that this is available on our website, in the Padlet, and also by clicking the image of the document should you have access to the PDF slide. So Chapter 3, in more detail, is a thorough review of an English learner's progress, as it is imperative to making an informed decision regarding a referral to special education. The chapter itself addresses the value of identifying factors in the instructional environment, the English language proficiency progress, and its effect on academic progress, as well as a review of all pertinent school intervention, behavioral, and health data, as well as ruling out extrinsic factors, all of which help lead a student study team to make an appropriate referral to special education. So in doing that, let's spend some time looking at this graphic. So this graphic illustrates considerations prior to referral for potential special education eligibility. So again, think of this as an iterative process. It's continual. It's not a point A to point B. It continues. It's cyclical. So when we start at number 1, we're looking at the referral made by staff, parent, guardian, counselor. Anyone who has direct knowledge of the student, their abilities, or any potential areas of need. So we're going to spend a lot of our time this morning living in this section. How is it that we make an informed and appropriate referral for a student's assessment for potential special education services eligibility? So to set the context a little bit more clearly, let's look at this video on under and over identification of ELs in special education. Let's spend some minutes listening, and then we'll come together at the end.
I wondered if we could just have take a 30,000-foot view for a minute in terms of both over and under identification of English language learners in special education, and why both of those things happen and why it's so hard.
Right. When you look broadly at it, really in places that have significant amount of ELL support, bilingual education, ESL support, really systems that are looking at culturally and linguistically appropriate practices, the percentages of ELL students who also have special education needs end up being really close to monolingual English children, so that the percentages are about the same. When you move away from those, and you are in systems that maybe either don't have the resources or are learning about serving English language learners, so there aren't enough services or supports to address their language learning needs, then often we want students to get help. So then often, because special education is there, that seems to be the first place that people go. But for English language learners who are really just in that process, who they may be having challenges, but they're really just English language learners having challenges and going through that developmental process, special education isn't where they need to be. We need to make our English language learning services and bilingual services and culturally responsive environments, broaden those programs to serve them. So that's where sometimes there's over-identification because we don't necessarily have the services that we need for English language learners. In under-identification, I think people are a little bit nervous because they're wondering, well, they're English language learners. Of course they're going, maybe they're having challenges because of that. And so people are a little bit nervous to go the route of special education. But what we know is that our English language learners who also have specific language impairment, learning disabilities, reading difficulties, are really already in our schools. You know, they're already there. So it's really about building systems that allow us to find those students in a timely manner, so we can support them. So yeah, making our systems more culturally linguistically responsive and building ESL, bilingual programming, dual immersion programming, allows us to really be able to see those students in multiple contexts that are appropriate for them, and we're able to find them. But I think that's, from the 30,000. Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so I've done a lot of talking. Now you've had a chance to hear from somebody else. I want you to take a couple of minutes to flood the chat with some reflections, some comments, some aha moments as you listen to this conversation on under and over identification of English learners in special education. Go ahead and share with us. And then if any salient points pop up, definitely our chat moderators will let us know. Our moderators, by the way, are Lupita from our team and Debbie from our team as well. What are some issues that you specifically have witnessed, are concerned about, want to do something about in regards to under and over identification of English learners in special education? We like asking these questions because this gives us an insight as to what experiences are like in the field statewide. Now, keeping all of that in mind, because we are going to be doing something with that information and those reflective points as we process this entire area, which is all things inclusive of pre-referral practices. Let's keep that in mind as we continue. So when we think of the pre-referral process, it can be vast and overwhelming because we are cognizant of the fact that we might have written policies, yet the process, the actual process we engage in, might not be exactly as written. On top of that, there are many variables in the process of pre-referral recommendations for assessment, starting from tools and resources. So oftentimes when we have a student come up for student support team, MTSS support, RTI support, we might have tools and resources for data collection that run the gamut from anecdotal to data charts to spreadsheets to computer printouts. So we are going to provide some resources directly linked from the practitioner's guide to support us in navigating this process that we understand can be overwhelming and that at times might seem completely unstructured. So we are here to help use the process illustrated in Chapter 3 and give you some tools to fulfill some of these requirements to make sure that we are making appropriate referrals for potential special education eligibility. So let's jump right in. So there are some considerations prior to referral for special education eligibility. So though we know this to be true, it's really nice to see it in a graphic visually. Figure 3.1 gives us a visual of what the pre-referral data sources may be. So in the pre-referral process, we're looking at 3 distinct steps. We're looking at collecting data from the cumulative file check, identifying potential extrinsic factors, and intervention data summaries. So we're going to be looking at this figure chunk by chunk and identifying resources that can support the team. And I say team because, as always, we want to really zero in on the need of having a multidisciplinary team. When we're talking about English learners, with a potential need for referral for eligibility for special education services, we really want to make sure that we have an English language specialist at the table, whether it be an English language and ELIT, whether it be a TOSA, an ELD teacher, somebody that has knowledge of second language learning and the process of language acquisition. Is critical to have this person involved in this process, as we want to ensure that these are appropriate referrals being made. So let's go straight into the checklist. So Appendix 3.1 in the Practitioner's Guide gives you a checklist for carrying out the recommendations, the referral process for English learners. So this is a great resource developed by our friend, Dr. Jerice Butterfield, and some of her additional colleagues, and it talks about specific recommendations being made as to how we collect this data and what we want to do when we're initiating the referral process for English learners. So this is what kicks it off, right? We want to ensure that we are collecting data, intervention data. We also want to ensure that we are providing the appropriate supports for those identified areas of need. And again, this might look different ways. So this document is written in a narrative form to give you an idea as to what you are looking for. So this is a great resource for you to take back to your multidisciplinary teams, to your student study team, to your MTSS team, and review either as a starting point, as a means of refining existing practices, or as a means of confirming, hey, what we're doing is right. What we're doing aligns with best practice. So again, all of these resources are meant to be a supportive tool in your individual journey as you are looking to refine the pre-referral process for potential special education eligibility for our English learners. So, as always, we are going to stress to no end how important it is to engage in a multidisciplinary team approach. We are our own best scaffold, right? Just like students are their own best scaffold, as practitioners, we are our own best scaffold. So as we are engaging in these discussions, once a referral is made by staff, parent, guardian, or counselor, we want to be mindful of who makes up our multidisciplinary team, or our student study team, or whatever the acronym or name of that support team is at your site. So when you are engaging in these conversations, it is important to know who is going to be providing additional data points, information as it relates to the student. And as we mentioned earlier, of great importance is an English learner specialist, an EL-TOSA, an ELIT, an English language intervention teacher, an ELD teacher, anybody who would have knowledge of that, as well as other teachers, service providers, or people that know of the student as we're building this robust learner profile to identify a potential need. Then, as we're engaging in these conversations, we really want to take a deep dive into the student cumulative file check. A cum file can be overwhelming too, because there might be a myriad documents housed within, and it's hard to know where to start. So when you are engaging in the identification of students' targeted needs via the team process, a great starting point is that cum file. And what Appendix 3.2 does is it gives you a roadmap, so to speak, a guide as to what information is most salient and giving you a place to document it all so that it's all living in one place, so to speak. So Appendix 3.2 can be found by either clicking in our Padlet or clicking on this document itself, the image, if you have the PDF slide. And what's great about the way that this appendix is linked here is that it is downloadable, savable, printable, shareable. Once you download it to whatever your preferred local destination is, you can modify it and save it as needed and create multiple electronic files for students. So if you are multidisciplinary team student success team member, know that this resource is available to you should you want to incorporate it in your process or use it as a starting point to modify your existing practice, or to just, as we mentioned earlier, just say, you know what we have is exactly this, we're going to keep on doing it. So again, a resource for you to help navigate the CUME files so that you can get test scores all in one place, perhaps vision, hearing, screening results, and additional points that are going to help address and build this learner profile as we learn more about the student, where they are, and supports that might possibly be needed. A critical point to address also are extrinsic factors. So when we are identifying a student's targeted needs, we want to know what additional outside factors might be impacting achievement, progress, mastery. Identifying if there is perhaps a health need, a nutrition need, anything medically related, limited schooling. Again, not to say that these things have no role, but being aware of extrinsic factors that exist and how they converge and impact the student's individual needs and progress is critical in addressing areas of need. So again, this extrinsic factors support document is Appendix 3.3, and it is titled just that, English Learner Extrinsic Factors. So it's very self-explanatory and again, downloadable, fillable, printable for you to use in your process. And it gives you a lot of guidance as to how to complete it. And also the way the questions are structured section by section give the team a view of how it is that certain areas of the students' extrinsic needs might be impacting and how to address them. So again, a great resource to just map things out as we're ruling out or ruling in additional factors. So then we come to intervention summaries. So we know that we want to ensure that we get ahead of any potential need. However, there are times where a student requires interventions, and we know that interventions can vary in intensity, right? So it's important for us to have one place to document this data, because oftentimes we have data points that exist in multiple places with multiple people, and it's hard to look at it all in one place. What Appendix 3.4 does is it gives you that one place. It allows you to progress monitor and data collect. It gives you some guidance and some support in documenting what integrated and designated ELD looks like for the student. You have a space to enter that information in. When we're talking about comprehensive ELD, are we able to identify where integrated takes place and where designated takes place, and what might those supports look like? And then are students' needs related to a language difference or a disability? And that's where it gets tricky, right? But the more information we have to begin teasing out those intertwined sections that sometimes can get a little difficult to do, the more data we have, the more information we have, the not easier, right? But it facilitates the process. It doesn't make it so that it's clear as day, but it gives us a starting point, an anchor to our conversations, so that we can then engage in these conversations that begin to help us unwind where some of these things might be tightly bound. So now, a poll. So this question is pulled from the frequently asked questions section in Chapter 3, linked in the post-it. But don't go ahead, don't go check. Here's the question first. Is it advisable to group English learners with non-English learners for intervention? Give you a minute or so. Go ahead and take on that poll. It's fully Anonymous. Yes, no, maybe. Or as in most things special ed, it depends. Okay, so 69% said no. 20% said they're not sure. And the rest, I'm not good at math, said yes. Is that correct? Okay, so let's check. Yes. English learners may benefit, those mays, right, from being grouped with non-English learners and with English-speaking peers with similar learning needs. Here's another one. However, it is important to remember that the English learners are progress monitored separately from the English-only peers and compared to like peers to determine if appropriate levels of progress are being made. Take into consideration the English language proficiency of the student when grouping for instruction. So again, it depends, right? But largely, yes. English learners may benefit from being grouped with non-English learners and with English-speaking peers with similar learning needs. Always keeping those mays and those howevers at the forefront of our mind, though, because we know that we want to look at the individual. So along with this question, you'll find additional questions in the FAQs, frequently occurring questions related to all things referral and pre-referral. Feel free to access those FAQs to gain more information and maybe do some myth busting. I know they've helped me clarify some thoughts or ideas that I had. So again, great resource included at the end of each chapter of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. So finally, when we're looking at this process on making those initial referrals and engaging in the decision-making process, we have Appendix 3.5, which is a flowchart. And it's regarding the initial referral and the decision-making process. So like those dreaded flowcharts from my 7th grade year, this one, opposed to those, is really helpful because it helps guide this process. It helps guide you through this process as you're making a series of decisions related to individual students after having considered the CUME file, extrinsic factors, and the intervention summary. Because again, we want to engage in this decision-making process fully informed or informed to the best of our abilities using existing resources. With the tools shared earlier, you now have a way of doing that, of coming to the table with your multidisciplinary team, having that flow chart on the table, engaging in discussion, and really delving deep into some of those very nuanced conversations. We recognize that. We recognize that these types of conversations can be difficult to have because sometimes things aren't as clearly delineated or can be separated as to this is due to the language issue, this is due to a potential disability, or this is due to a variety of extrinsic factors, whether it be limited schooling, access to appropriate supports, whether they be academic, nutritional, medical. Again, all of these additional extrinsic factors that definitely impact a student's performance. So again, coming to the table prepared, ready to engage in conversation, to be able to make a referral that is appropriate as informed by the data you have in front of you, by the resources you have in front of you, because that is what we aim to do, to come forward with a robust student profile to consider the individual students and begin to make those referrals that are based on existing data points, information, and input from a multidisciplinary team who knows the student in a variety of contexts. Center in that as well Parents. Parents, incredibly important, incredible resource as we engage in this conversation and in this process of making appropriate referrals for English learners with a potential eligibility need for special education assessment. So with that, we're very close to the 9:30 mark. So we're going to go ahead and jump ahead of that and give you guys a break. Because when we return from break, Lupita is going to take over and she's going to walk us through the rest of chapter 3 and engage in some discussions and activities as we delve a little deeper into that. So with that, we're looking at a break of 10 minutes. So it is on my watch, 9:27. We will see you back at 9:37. Okay? All right. Take a break, walk away, and get yourself a nice cup of coffee or a drink of water. See you in a bit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. It's nice to take a little break and really give ourselves that grace, that time to process information. I know that we shared a lot of information with you. So welcome back from your break. My name is Lupita Olguin-Rubio. I'm a SELPA coordinator as well at Imperial County SELPA, and I'm very happy to be here. So coming back, circling back to really thinking about our current practices in respect to our pre-referral activities. So taking a look at this graphic, let's focus a little bit on section 3, or step 3, if you will, that indicates the pre-referral process as an iterative process. It's cyclical. So in other words, we really want to take into consideration the data that we're gathering, analyzing it, making appropriate adjustments to the interventions that the students may need as we are determining whether or not an assessment is warranted. So again, this graphic is a reminder of how we need to circle back and have conversations about the current data and the adjustments that are made to see whether or not progress is made or to what degree progress is made. And again, determining if indeed we need to move on to the next step of assessing for possible eligibility for special education services. So as stated earlier, progress monitoring is key, right? We need to understand how well the student is progressing with the interventions that are being implemented. We need to make sure that the data that is gathered is analyzed for that particular area of need or the challenges that are being presented. And then as we're collecting that data, the team analyzes the data and has conversations about how and when to move forward, right? So again, this is a cyclical process. This graphic shows us with specific time frames, 4 to 6 weeks of implementation before we can determine or move on to the next step, whether it's introducing a different intervention, giving that intervention a little bit more time, or making the appropriate adjustments. So in order for the team to make a well-informed decision about whether or not assessment for special education eligibility is warranted, we want to consider some key components, some critical factors. This flowchart that we have here puts together in 4 parts or 4 components some considerations that the team would benefit from exploring to help us do exactly that, to make a well-informed decision about whether or not the student is actually needs to move on to special education services. So in the next few slides, what we're going to do is we're going to explore each one of these 4 key components. We're going to dig into it a little bit. What you're going to see is that there will be some references to some of the tools that Vanessa walked us through a little while ago and some additional resources to help us gather information, to help us engage in dialogue about those specific features, to help us craft and create a profile, a student profile that is both culturally and linguistically appropriate, that also addresses their strengths as well as their areas of need, so that we can have a comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do and start teasing out the very specific and unique areas of need to determine whether or not they are related to language or definitely a true disability. So let's begin with the first component. So the first component is identified here as extrinsic factors. So for this particular area, the considerations that we want you to think about have to do with collecting that information, right? Collecting all the existing data, and that's where the resource of a CUME file check is critical. The resource that Vanessa talked to us earlier today about is kind of a sifter of sorts where you can organize the existing data and start looking at it in a more organized fashion to help us paint a clearer picture of what already exists, what information, what data already exists for this particular student. Also, what we want to consider is identifying any existing extrinsic factors, particularly any physical or psychological factors that may have an impact on the student's learning. So things such as current medical history, does the student have access to health? Has there been some trauma? So these are absolutely factors that definitely would have an impact on the student's learning. If the team should determine that truly the factors that are presenting challenges for student progress are related to some of these specific extrinsic factors, then a referral for either school-based or community-based resources is more appropriate to address the student's specific needs. The next component, which is related to personal and cultural factors that we want to take into consideration as we're gathering information to paint this comprehensive portrait of the student, has us take a closer look at personal and cultural factors. So you see that in the slide that it says this is a whole child approach. This really helps us think about extrinsic factors that are related to personal and cultural focuses on personal and cultural assets of the students. So again, it's an assets-based approach where we're taking into consideration what the student knows and understands about their primary language as well as English. We're also taking into consideration socioeconomic and social cultural factors. Having an interview with the parent will give us more information about what the student is able to do, how the student engages with other adults, at home, with neighbors, friends, etc. If the team determines that some of the factors that cause or potential causes to impact learning in a negative fashion are related to personal cultural factors, then again, rather than a referral for assessment to special education services, connecting the parents and the family to school-based and or community-based resources to address these very specific needs. The next component has to do with language development. Because we're talking about multilingual learners, it's critical that we take into consideration this component and the different features within it. When we're referring to a multilingual learner, we really need to look at proficiency skills and how those proficiency skills are being developed. We want to be able to access information and data that shows us information about actual language use, authentic language use, rather than in isolation, rather than students repeating or being prompted and responding, really engaging in language use in a classroom setting and in different settings to give us a clearer picture of the student's mastery of the English language and to what degree. We also want to consider the possibility of some supports for the teacher. Should there be a need for more English language development training, more information and or supports for implementing culturally and linguistically appropriate pedagogy. It's important for us to take all of these features into consideration as we are building this profile to more accurately determine what types of supports are actually needed. And finally, the last component in this flowchart involves the learning environments. It's absolutely critical that we take into consideration the learning environments in which the students are engaging in. We want to make sure that the context for learning is respectful, is accessible, it's inclusive, it's engaging, and that there are appropriate supports for the specific needs both academic, linguistic needs of the student to be able to accurately gauge progress and what type of progress and to what degree the progress is being made. This is where we want to take into consideration specific interventions, going back to the graphic, that section 3 graphic, where we're really taking a look at data, gathering data, analyzing the data, and making appropriate adjustments. It's critical that the learning environment, which is where the learning is happening, the academics, the language development, the social emotional, that those contexts for learning, again, are sound and are really providing a prime ground for learning for all students. The lower section of this infographic offers us 2 reminders. The first one has to do with the type of support that we're offering in the primary language. Now, primary language is truly an asset, and particularly when we're talking about assessments. We want to make sure that our assessments that we are implementing to help us give us information about the students when necessary and when appropriate are offered in the student's primary language when we are truly trying to identify and figure out or pinpoint whether or not there is a need related to a disability. We don't want language to be a barrier, if you will, to keep us from really knowing and the student to be able to show what they know. So it's something that we absolutely want to keep in mind. The second thing that we want to remember is the critical role of comprehensive ELD. For all English learners, comprehensive ELD is part of their Tier 1 instruction. So we want to make sure that comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated ELD, is happening for our English learners. It is important that they receive effective, solid, consistent English language development instruction for 2 purposes: to provide access to the content area across content and throughout the instructional day, and very specifically for the purpose of building the English language development skills, both all inclusive of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So these are 2 reminders, and at the bottom of this infographic, you'll see some links that will help support us in really making sure that we are addressing these 2 pieces. So at this point, we want to give you a little bit of time to pause and process the information that I've just shared with you. So we want to front load these questions to help them put them in the front of your mind, because in a little while, we're going to have you take this information in a breakout room and start thinking about your current practices, policies, activities related to the pre-referral process. So I want you to think about these questions as we move forward and engaging in taking a closer look, spending some time really digging into the resources that Vanessa and I have shared with you up to this point. So again, the purpose for you engaging and digging into these resources is so that you're really thinking about reflecting, possibly refreshing and refining your current practices, right? So that it would have an impact on your pre-referral process. So what I want you to think about is what are your current documented pre-referral process? What are your current practices? Are your progress monitoring method tools appropriate specifically for English learners? Do they contain a language that is biased and it may be affecting the data? So be thinking about these questions as we further explore both this flowchart and those additional resources that accompany the different components of this flowchart that Vanessa shared with you earlier today. So on that note, we're going to take a closer look at a note-catching guide that we've created to help you organize this information and jot down perhaps some things that you want to remember, resources that you want to take a closer look at moving forward and or share with others, as well as identifying some actionable next steps. So you have in your Padlet, as well as in the slide deck here, a note-taking guide. Once you click on that link, you're going to be prompted to make a copy. Once you make a copy for yourself, this is a document for yourself to be able to do exactly that. Take notes, identify what resources you want to explore further or share, and identify and create some actionable next steps. So the note-taking guide is going to be something that you can use individually and then share out moving forward with your teams. So I think one of my colleagues is going to create some breakout rooms for you to do exactly that. So you will have some links in the chat. The note-taking guide should be dropped in there shortly. And within the note-taking guide, you're going to find links to all of these resources that you see here. So there's no need to go back and forth to different resources. The note-taking guide itself has those reflection questions, as well as links to all of the resources, including the documents that Vanessa shared, as well as the pre-referral flowchart that I walked you through. So I think I'm waiting to see if they're ready to go. Okay, so we're going to create some breakout rooms, and we're going to give you about 15, perhaps 20 minutes to give you this gift of time to engage in becoming familiar with these resources. Now remember, all you really need is to click on the note-taking guide, because within the note-taking guide, you're going to have access to all of the resources that we've shared with you up to this point. No need to go back and forth. So let's put 20 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes on the clock. Okay, and we're back. Thank you for coming back and rejoining us in the discussion regarding your current practices and activities related to your pre-referral processes. We really wanted to be intentional about giving you this gift of time. And however, we do understand that when you're not here with your team, that it makes it a little bit challenging to have deep, rich, candid conversations and discussion about your current processes and practices. And perhaps you may not have answers to some of the questions that the tools direct you to, or that perhaps are lingering in your mind as you're digging into these resources. However, know that the purpose of these training, the purpose of us presenting this information and tools to you, whether you're here with the team, you're here individually, is so that you are constantly thinking about the bigger system and the people that need to be involved in this conversation. So if you didn't really get to the point of creating an actionable step that you think would impact the process, think about what you can do within your own sphere of influence. If you're a practitioner, perhaps you are thinking about comprehensive ELD in general. How familiar am I with the ELD standards? Do I need to look for further training? What are some of the resources that are readily available to me to help me learn a little bit more about the standards and how to implement activities and lessons to help support language development for my English learners, particularly the English learners that continue to present difficulties in their learning. And so kind of teasing out some of those things that we've shared with you today, those themes, those topics, as they relate to you in your respective role today. So don't feel like you can't contribute to the system, because we all contribute to the system, whether it's partnering with somebody who can help you think through what are some of the things that I still need to gather, what more evidence do I need based on the information and resources that were shared with me today, or whether it is something that I can do in my classroom tomorrow. Well, not tomorrow. Tomorrow's Saturday, but on Monday. So on that note, we have some debrief questions that we want you to think about, and we are going to ask you to please flood the chat in response to some of these questions. So let's think about what connections you made, right, during the digging deep into the resources, or perhaps during the discussion in your breakout room. What connections were you able to make? What questions might you still have? And what are your potential actionable next steps? So as we are moving along with this presentation, we're going to ask you to take a moment and just flood the chat, addressing one, two, or all of these questions. And we have our moderators who will be responding or confirming, or also engaging in the questions as you drop your thoughts into the chat. So back to the pre-referral process. So when students continue to have problems, when they still display learning skills that are not at the degree or are not presenting or are not developing, we really want to take into consideration this step 3 or this phase 3. To what degree are we implementing, gathering data, analyzing data, and making the appropriate adjustments? Because we want to make sure that the information that we have is current, it's accurate, and it's painting a clear picture of what students are able to do and what continues to be a struggle for them, a challenge for them. So as we're thinking about a language difference in comparison to language disability and how those skills and characteristics, behaviors manifest themselves in English learners who may or may not have a learning disability, it's important for us to be able to tease out and understand the similarities and differences. So we're going to let an expert in the field share a little bit of insight into that and how that impacts over-identification of English learners who may need special education or who may not need special education but end up in those types of services. So we'll cue the video.
When you look at over-identification, you get kind of the opposite face of the problem. In this case, people think that the problem is a disability and they don't consider linguistic or cultural differences or educational opportunity as contributors to the problem. And so they make a referral too quickly. And then you get into some really difficult issues. We don't have the assessment instruments that we need to make an accurate identification of disabilities among students who speak different languages. Even when you have assessment instruments available in Spanish, they may also be culturally and linguistically irrelevant for the student that you're concerned about. So the assessment instruments, you can take almost any student and assess them with the available tools, and they'll qualify because the instruments are inappropriate. Sometimes we make the decision that general education can't serve the needs of the student, particularly because we have populations of students that really have significant learning difficulties. If you look at students with interrupted formal schooling, for example, who come here as adolescents, haven't been in school or have had inconsistent schooling, the gap is so wide that the sentiment is that if you make a special education referral, the student will be with a teacher who has specialized skills, smaller classes, materials designed to close those significant gaps. And so special education can actually become a dumping ground for students who have significant difficulties for reasons other than the presence of a disability. So overrepresentation becomes a huge issue because we haven't been able to overcome what is oftentimes negative expectations associated with a disability. So the student over time does worse because they're not getting the appropriate instruction, because we may not have special education teachers who understand how to support the language and cultural needs of the student. So even though they're in this smaller class, the gap can widen because the instruction is inappropriate. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to overrepresentation. And I think one of the big issues for students is that once we put them in, we seldom let them out. And so we identify students as having disabilities very early, and then they can spend the rest of their school career in a special education program or receiving special education services, even though they don't have a disability.
So we had an opportunity to hear Dr. Ortiz share a little bit about how important it is to be able to gauge and have a good comprehensive understanding of what the student is able to do, and to lead us in the direction of whether or not it warrants assessment for special education eligibility. However, whenever there is an occasion where the student still continues to lag or to have challenges in progress, academic and or language, then we do want to take the time to consider, is this a language difference, due to a language difference, or due to a disability? And so the multidisciplinary team has an opportunity to really think about and reflect on this question. have we carefully reviewed and discussed the comparisons between language difference versus disability? Practitioners need to have a very clear understanding of how language acquisition, second language acquisition, manifests itself in learning compared to perhaps some indicators of a learning disability that may also be displayed in how the student uses language. It's important for us to understand the differences and as well as how they overlap so that we are able to, again, gather information, analyze the information, and make an effective determination of what our next step is so that we are able to support the students specifically for the needs that they have. So how do we do this? How do we determine and really build our own knowledge of what language differences and disabilities are, how they are the same, how they are different, how they overlap? So for this, we want to share with you and give you some time, again, a gift of time, to become familiar with resources that can be found in the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. In this case, we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring Figure 3.3 that does exactly that. It identifies both characteristics of second language acquisition that can manifest in certain behaviors, as well as some indicators of possible learning disability that an English learner may display. And so what this figure does is it organizes both second language acquisition behaviors in learning, as well as possible indicators of a learning disability for English learners specifically in different contexts. So what we had originally planned was to, again, set you out into breakout rooms, but we realized that sometimes you just need some quiet time with yourself and with the resource. So that's what we're going to offer you for this resource that we want to share with you today. So rather than create breakout rooms, we want to give you an opportunity to become familiar with Appendix 3.3. And so this is what we're going to ask you to think about and how to engage in exploring and reviewing and becoming familiar with this resource for the purpose of developing some knowledge for yourself to the point where you are either going to really begin to look at how students are engaging in your classroom or in your observations, or perhaps share it with somebody else of what are the similarities and differences between language acquisition behaviors and indicators of a possible disability for English learners. So give you some time to dig into 3.3, but we do ask you to think about these two questions. As you are becoming familiar with the resource, think about how might you use this resource in your current role, as well as who might you want to share this resource with to start doing exactly that, to be able to get to the point where you have a conversation with the team who is determining whether or not it is necessary to move on to assessment for possible eligibility for special education. So again, the gift of time, we're going to put, let's say about 7 minutes on the clock to give you some time, sufficient time to explore this resource. And again, think about how much you use this resource in your respective role, and also who might you share it with. So 7 minutes on the clock, see you back in a few. Welcome back, folks. Hopefully you were able to engage in exploring this Appendix 3.3 further. There were 9 sections or 9 areas, academic skill areas within this resource. I hope that you had an opportunity to look through the entire resource, all of the 9 tables, and maybe spend a little bit of time exploring a few that pertain more to your scope of work. It's important for us to think about how these resources are going to impact me individually in my respective role, as well as perhaps my colleagues, my counterparts, as this all pertains to really thinking about what are the best practices that we can include or refine as part of our pre-referral process activities in making sure that we are providing the appropriate supports for our English learners as we begin to think about whether or not they truly need an assessment to determine eligibility for special education. So it's important for us to tease out language development, natural language development as it manifests in learning, and as compared to indicators of a possible learning disability. And that could be a little bit confusing, right? When students perhaps don't have an opportunity to engage in a context for learning where their cultural and linguistic resources are being taken into consideration. Perhaps they're not engaging in comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated ELD fully. And so those two examples could have an impact that can manifest themselves in delay in learning, but truly it's more of an impact in language development as opposed to a true manifestation of a learning disability. So it's really important that we take all of those pieces into consideration and connect the dots, if you will, to see in what directions do they point. This impact in the challenges that are being displayed, does it relate more to language development, lack of instruction in language development, and or a true possible learning disability? So back to our wheel, right? And the wheel for me represents how important it is for us to take each one of these sections into consideration. It is critical that the data that we gather paints a comprehensive portrait of what the student is able to do, both in language, in academics, and social emotional development, and also what challenges are being representative of this, and how are we gauging and providing support for all of these things, and gauging progress to begin to make sure that we are teasing out possible opportunities to misdiagnose, if you will, and in this case, overrepresent English learners in a special education setting. So again, the multidisciplinary team has a very important role in gathering enough effective current information about the student as we move forward in this process. So it's important for us to, if we don't know or understand the process fully, is to ask around, ask questions, ask your administrator if you're a practitioner. If you're an administrator, perhaps ask your district's leads, your English learning lead, your special ed lead, to give you some insight, to share some tools, so that everybody involved has a clear understanding of the current policies and practices, and therefore you'll be able to take some of your learning today, some of the tools, and implement them as a way to reflect, refresh, refine your current practices so that we have a better wheel, if you will, in terms of identifying what our students actually truly need, and we're able to connect them to those supports and resources more effectively. Okay, so we're going to flood the chat again because we're going to close up, and closing for chapter 3, we want you to take a quick few seconds and drop in the chat a new learning or learnings and something that's still kind of lingering in your mind. So it would take a few seconds, flood the chat, a new learning, and perhaps a wondering that you still have around all the information that Vanessa and I shared with you up to this point. And as you're doing that, I want to remind you that as well as in the Padlet, you can also find easy access to all of the resources that we shared with you today up to this point, and additional resources related to this topic and specifically related to Chapter 3 in this slide deck. So all of the figures that we shared with you today can be found both in the slide deck as well as in the Padlet for Chapter 3, so as well as all the appendices. So everything that you had an opportunity to explore, hopefully if you felt like, oh, I need to come back, circle back to that one, I want to make sure that I know where it is. There's multiple places that you can find it. The slide deck, you can find it in the Padlet. And again, all of these are tools that reference the topic and are related specifically to Chapter 3. Another really important feature of Chapter 3 and all of the chapters in the Practitioner's Guide is this section of frequently asked questions. So I appreciate the FAQ section of the Practitioner's Guide because it helps me think through questions that I wouldn't even consider to ask. Have you ever heard, you don't know what you don't know? So for myself specifically, my background is specifically in literacy and English language development. So I am, like many of you here today, or have been learning more and more about special education education, special education services, and the different types, the range of disabilities and what they look like, what they could look like, and how might we be able to best support our English learners who are dually identified students, or in this case, who may potentially be dually identified students. So the FAQ section after each chapter helps me think about questions that myself, in my scope of work, in my background and expertise, may not think about. So again, these are good questions to start dialogue as you're bridging two different fields, if you will, special education, general education, as well as to build your background knowledge related to the topics discussed in Chapter 3. And also we have an infographic. So these infographics are created specifically to address all the key points, all the key topics and resources within each specific chapter. In this case, you're seeing here infographic for Chapter 3. These infographics can be found on our website, but you have easy access here on the slide. They can be downloaded and printed in their entirety or by section to help you ease into building your background knowledge around what is within this particular chapter in the Practitioner's Guide. I'm a visual learner, so I really appreciate the fact that these are available to us. And again, like I shared with you, because I don't have that rich background in special education, this type of resource helps me, again, organize information that I need to know and understand in my role as an English learner lead, to help ask the questions, to help build my background, and to help contribute to a system to improve outcomes for all English learners, especially English learners who are dually identified. So that's a great resource. So with that, we're going to give you about let's do a 15-minute break just to give you a little extra breather. We're going to shift gears and we're going to dive into elements of Chapter 4. So see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you. And welcome back. So just a quick recap on the flowchart that was shared with you earlier today. It's important for us to be diligent as part of a multidisciplinary team member about the different resources and information that we seek and that we gather and analyze, again, to help us make the best informed decision about whether or not a student needs to move forward and be assessed for eligibility for special education services. It's critical that we take the time to ask questions, to take a look and consider what the learning environment looks like or doesn't look like for the student we're considering, and more importantly, the different sections or elements related to extrinsic factors. There was a few questions regarding newcomers that I want to take this opportunity to address. It's important for us to recognize that multilingual learners are really very diverse. So think about yourself as a newcomer in a new country. So you are moving to a different country. You don't speak the language. However, you're an illiterate person, right? You bring a wealth of language resources in your primary language, and you can, to some degree, be able to contribute and engage in the different communities and the different activities to the best of your ability as a newcomer. So I want you to think about that. Newcomers entering our school system are the same. They don't always have the same characteristics. For example, we may have newcomers who have interrupted schooling, or you can have a newcomer who has extensive education, very high academic skills in their primary language, and perhaps even some English language skills. And so when that is the case, depending on the type of newcomer, how we proceed in gathering information is going to be very distinct. So a cookie cutter approach in gathering information, data about our English learners who we think may need some additional supports in the form of special education services, before we move on in that direction, we need to make sure that we gather the appropriate information that we need of all of our English learners. And moving forward with the approach anti-cookie cutter. That's what I'm going to call it. So really take into consideration all of the extrinsic factors as they relate to each unique child. So here we are going to recap this component of the flowchart, which is personal and cultural factors, which I kind of sort of alluded to in the previous section as well. This is our whole child approach, right? We want to be able to take into consideration and have an assets-based mindset that students bring a wealth of knowledge in that they have language skills, language resources. Again, think back about you as a newcomer in a different country, and you are bringing with you all of the skills that you have, all of the knowledge that you have in your primary language, in your context of from where you live, where you come from, and you're bringing that. It's an asset, skills that are asset-based to help you engage and communicate and build further build your knowledge in this new context. So again, if you really start thinking about it that way, I think we're able to kind of enter into a student's world, if you will, an English learner's world, and help mitigate learning through that lens. So again, whole child approach, assets-based approach. So they're not empty vessels. They don't come to us with limitations. They come to us with different language skills and abilities and knowledge that we absolutely must take into consideration and ask ourselves, as a result of my understanding or my knowledge, what are some of the questions that perhaps I'm overlooking? And again, back to the FAQs, as somebody who doesn't have a special education background, it's critical for me to build that background in my role as an English learner lead. Otherwise, I'm going to miss the mark and miss opportunities to gather information. That is critical for me to be able to contribute to the conversation about whether or not this particular English learner truly needs special education services, or do we need to shift our energy into another direction and build comprehensive ELD? Or maybe we need to address some personal or cultural factors that are having an impact on the student's learning. And again, it's important for us to recognize that there's a lot of moving parts, but when we're talking about one specific child, then that can be the focus, and that can be what we are searching for and asking and gathering and analyzing to make that well-informed decision of how to proceed. And language development, right? We're talking about multilingual learners, language development. It really is at the core of the conversation. And because it's at the core of the conversation, we absolutely have to ensure that your English learner leads, whether they're your teachers, your support providers, your TOSAs, your district office folks that can contribute to that conversation. It's important to get that information from the perspective of the English learner lead, English language development teacher, the parents, absolutely, because they're going to give us some insight as to how the child is engaging in language use at home with the adults, with the siblings, with friends, and how and when English is used, right? Sometimes children feel very comfortable using English at home because it's with their siblings and with their friends, as opposed to in school, because they don't feel comfortable. This is where, and I'm going to move on to the next section, which is learning environments. This is where and why it's important to consider the context for learning. Students need to feel welcome, respected, included, engaged, and they need to feel like they can contribute. And so that learning environment needs to be on point for all learners. This is truly where I stand by the statement that it's good for all kids. Yes, effective learning environments are good for all kids, especially kids who are new to our country, new to our system, new to the English language. It's really important for us to think about how is my environment as a classroom teacher set up that indicates that every child is part of this classroom, that every child can contribute, that everybody has something to share and opportunities to shine. So it's really important that we take this into consideration as well. We like to always point out that the MTSS framework and the UDL frameworks are absolutely the way to help teachers and school site administrators and system really shift their way of teaching school, right? It's a way of teaching, it's a way of learning that is exactly that, inclusive, respectful, engaging, and supportive of all learners. So again, the two reminders that we want you to really think about, because again, we're talking about multilingual learners, the role and responsibility of comprehensive ELD. All English learners, including English learners, dually identified students, English learners with an IEP, absolutely must receive comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated ELD. So if you are thinking about your current system and you're wondering, I don't know what that looks like, it's an opportunity to ask, right? Who might know? If you're the ELD teacher and you're thinking, yeah, I don't know if I get special ed kids in my program, or I'm not really sure, you know, if I know which dually identified students are receiving comprehensive ELD. So if those questions are popping up after, whether you were in a breakout room or when you were exploring some of the resources, it's time to ask. It's time to reach out to your colleagues, to your administrators, and ask that question. Because it's not until we are making sure that our English learners are benefiting from an effective comprehensive ELD program can we truly move forward with identifying challenges in their learning. They are learning a new language as well as learning content in that language. That's a double doozy, right? So we have to make sure that in our respective roles that we are providing either training, support in the form of coaching to teachers, making sure that all practitioners have the appropriate resources, that they understand the role and responsibility of comprehensive ELD as it pertains to their respective role, and what it looks like for English learners and English learners with disabilities. So that requires training and it requires collaboration. So also on the other side of that section of the flowchart, we want you to think about the role of primary language. Again, earlier today when I gave you the example of being you being a newcomer in a new country, you're bringing with you your primary language resources, which are assets. And so that's what I want you to think about when we're working and dealing with English learners within the educational system. Their primary language and the resources that they have, whether it may be a few or a lot, are assets. And so to some degree and to the best of our ability, we need to intentionally make it a point to build on what students are bringing to the table as far as their primary language skills are concerned. It also merits us trying to find out what they know and understand about the English language as well. Sometimes I see that an English learner understands what you're saying when we're talking specifically about perhaps newcomers or emerging English learners. They will demonstrate that they understand, but not be able to respond to you in the form of the spoken language or the written language just yet. So the fact that students are developing their receptive comprehension tells you that those English language skills are truly being developed. And so we want to tap into those skills and build upon them. And what that requires is a solid foundation of English language development instruction. And so all of our students need to receive that. All of our students are required to receive that. It is a civil right issue for them to receive comprehensive ELD. It's not a nice thing to do. It's something that we must do. It's a moral imperative to move forward and make sure that all of our English learners are receiving this type of instruction. So with that, I want you to go back at your leisure, whether it's later today or maybe tomorrow or maybe on Monday. Go back to this flowchart and really be thinking about your specific role and how some of the components or the accompanying tools within the component can be used by you. And more importantly, who else needs to have this information to help build that common language within your multidisciplinary team to develop a process that is going to better inform you as a multidisciplinary team to provide the necessary and appropriate supports for the English learners that we're considering perhaps needing an assessment that leads to eligibility for special education. It's critical. It's critical that we're able to distinguish between a language disability and what that looks like, the indications of that, in learning, compared to a language difference and what that looks like in learning. It's critical that practitioners who are working directly with English learners know and understand the differences and the similarities so that when we proceed with assessments, when we proceed with progress monitoring, we're able to gauge and distinguish between the two and not misinterpret what it would be a normal language acquisition behavior in an academic setting as opposed to an indicator of a possible learning disability. So again, it goes back to training, it goes back to developing a common language and understanding, and it goes back to really taking a look at our current practices and processes and determining where is it that we need to refresh, refine, and maybe even add to our processes because we're lacking information that perhaps is going to be critical in determining the appropriate supports. Think about it as a way of providing the appropriate supports and interventions that students need, as opposed to a way to get students into special education because they're going to need those supports, right? Well, they may not need those very specific supports. So how do we know that? We need to take the time to ask questions, to reach out to counterparts. Don't be afraid to reach out across the room and talk to your gen ed friend or your sped friend or your EL lead and ask the question. Tell me what's your role in the IEP process? What tools do you use? Because, I came across these tools and they seem pretty good. It's initiating that dialogue because you have a role in the system, starting with what you do in your classroom and how you collaborate with others who also have an impact, whether it's direct or indirect, on student learning. So again, we hope that although we have lots of resources to share with you today, we hope that the fact that there are so many, that we organize them in such a way to help you think about them in parts and to help you localize them as they pertain to you in your respective role. At the end of the day, we're here to provide support for all of our students, right? All of our students, and each student is unique. Each student brings his or her own skills and abilities and resources, as we do as adults who are leading and guiding them in their educational journey. So we have a tremendous responsibility to get it right. And our goal here at Imperial County SELPA through this grant, Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities, specifically addresses the role of practitioners and everybody else who is designed to help and support practitioners to do this very important, very complex work. So again, we want to be able to offer you the tools, resources, time, and space to be able to do that. So with that, folks, I think it's about 11:15. I know that we have a lunch set at 11:30, but I think it's okay to kind of give you a little extra time in your lunch. So we're going to do, you want to do an hour? We're going to do an hour? We're going to do an hour for lunch. So with that, folks, again, feel free to continue to add to the chat box. We will try our very best to answer your questions now. And if we can't address them now, know that we will address them and get back to you. That is our primary goal, is to be able to make clear for everybody, wherever you are and whatever you do, how to use these resources to help improve outcomes for all English learners and English learners with disabilities. So with that, we'll see you back in an hour, and that will be at 12:20. Enjoy your lunch.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed a nice lunch, took your brain break, had some time to yourself, hopefully with your camera off. I know many of us multitask in this Zoom world that we find ourselves in. So thank you again for all of your participation, for taking away time from your busy day to engage in this very important topic with us, as we are all committed, as we know you are, just by participating in today's session, to improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. This morning, we had a review of Chapter 3, in which we discussed all things pre-referral and referral. That takes us now to Chapter 4 within the California Practitioner's Guide. Remember, your Padlet has each chapter in alignment, and you'll see all of the resources that we'll reference during this session. So I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya, here from Imperial County SELPA. You had my esteemed colleagues, Lupita and Vanessa, this morning, and I will be covering all things assessment. So making some assumptions that as you review that pre-referral process, that in fact your SST teams had those conversations, those iterative cycles of interventions, of practices, of targeted supports for both the teacher of the student and the student. Because as we know, that pre-referral process is so very important to assure that, again, we don't over-refer students whom are English learners for special education assessment when it's not in fact necessary. So that's where we're picking up today in Chapter 4. So today we'll review some processes and practices related to the federal and state guidance, those mandates and requirements regarding eligibility. As again, we think back to language difference versus disability. And in some cases, although all the interventions have been put into play, where sound ELD instruction does live in Core 1, both integrated and designated ELD practices, practitioners and multidisciplinary teams, such as yourselves, may find that there is, in fact, a need for referral for special education. Referral in and of itself is not eligibility. So I'll be talking about those practices as we consider culturally and linguistically appropriate assessments for English learners. Also know from time to time we'll reference multilingual learners as we shift from English learners as sometimes being referred to as a deficit process thinking. And just as Lupita shared earlier, our students come with assets, with language and skills. It's that opportunity that we take to take those language skills and transition and support and bridge into learning English and building English language proficiency. So when we consider who may be eligible for special education, we need data. Valid and comprehensive assessments is what I'll lead into next, and also including the role, the active and meaningful engagement of parents and guardians through this assessment process as we learn more about students. Because what we hope to have shared with you this morning is that our multilingual learners are a varied, diverse group of students who come with a wealth of background and skill, and that information is pertinent to us to make comprehensive and valid decisions for our students. So we're living in Section 2, Chapter 4. For the remainder of this session today, we will honor breaks on every hour again to give you some downtime and give you some brain breaks. But we're going to jump right into this particular chapter. It is in your practitioner's guide and in the Padlet that we shared with you. So if you wanted to take segments of it, we hope that it's user-friendly. We also have an infographic for this chapter, which you could later use as another reference tool as hopefully you take this information to your multidisciplinary team members if they're not all here with you today. Some guiding questions of this chapter specifically for teachers, and I would change it to say more so for service providers as well, because I know we have some school psychologists, some speech pathologists, maybe even it's a literacy coach, EL coaches, where these are the questions that come to your mind when you consider assessments. What role do you play in the assessment process? As again, we know it is a multidisciplinary team process. So given your respective role, how can you support the assessment team? Because it's not solely the responsibility of the school psychologist. Yes, they play a very prominent role in assessment, as well as perhaps your speech therapist, your special education teachers. But as a community of practitioners who know and understand the needs of the student, that's where that pre-referral and referral data was so important to ensure that we're assessing appropriately. And it'll inform then not only the tools that are utilized for assessment, but how that assessment is conducted, and then interpreting that data to determine if in fact there is a disability or not. For our administrators on this call, very important that we recognize as administrators the state and federal regulations, the guidance, and the responsibilities that we carry to ensure that we support our staff so that they don't fall into practices that may lead to over-identification or under-identification of English learners as students with disabilities. I say we because I've had the experience of both being an administrator at the district level for special education, a principal, followed by my role at the county office, and running programs for students with moderate to severe disabilities prior to my current role as the SELPA director. You'll also hear me say we during the course of the conversation because I was a school psychologist many moons ago. So I will share with you from my own experiences as well as, again, the resources from the California Practitioner's Guide. So as we discussed earlier, again, putting to the forefront whom are our English learners. When we reference our English learners, yes, children who have another language in the home other than English. Our students with disabilities, when we say that, we want to clearly acknowledge that there are students who are multilingual learners, English learners, who have a disability within one of the 13 disability categories found in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And for each of those disability categories, there is a specific definition for each of those disability categories. What we also know is that students with disabilities, when we think of English learners with disabilities, that number across California fluctuates between 25% to 28%. So you might be thinking in your respective district, county office, school site where you serve, what is that percentage when you consider all of your English learners in their totality? How many are represented who are dually identified ELs and that have a disability? In California, these are the three most prominent disability categories where we find students as English learners being identified as a student with a disability. You'll see there SLD, specific learning disability, SLI, speech and language impairment, and autism, the top three. We definitely want to take note, though, to that first one, which is specific learning disability. We have found that across California, and many of you, I think, can attest to this in your own region, your own district and school site, that English learners are more than likely found to be eligible for special education in this particular disability category because it is quite broad. So I'm going to speak to this disability category specifically for specific learning disability, as again, given its definition, we may find that at times from referral process, pre-referral to referral, we stay very cognizant of, yes, there are gaps in learning. We know that. It may take more time for our English learners to develop English language proficiency and again, demonstrate skill towards grade level content. Nevertheless, that in and of itself is not a disability. Just as we know in the activity earlier that language difference itself, bilingualism itself, those are not disabilities. So we want to be very clear from the onset that being a second language learner, having a different L1, not yet building enough English language proficiency as terms that we hear, that in and of itself is not a disability. If you want to learn more about the disability categories themselves, this link found on this slide does take you to a reference in the Practitioner's Guide. On our website, we also have the definitions of each of the disability categories. For those of you who are maybe administrators and very familiar with the CalPAD system, we also have those definitions. They all match. They are bound by Ed code. And as assessment teams, we need to be responsive and understand what is the definition, the exact definition of each disability category, so that we ensure that if we are claiming that a student has a disability, that they truly have a disability as identified in that definition. So here's the definition of what is a specific learning disability. And you'll see there that a specific disability is not only that pattern of strength and weakness amongst academic skills, but it is also tied directly to a processing disorder. So it is a two-part definition. We can't have one without the other when we are saying that a child has a specific learning disability. So as we consider that, it's more than gaps in learning, more than concerns regarding the student's progression in English language development. We need to see that it's also attached to some difficulties, some neurological processing disorders that we have found through the assessment process. So as we consider specific learning disability, you also see a word in there, and you might want to circle it on your handout that says imperfect. I don't know about you in the field, but I know I don't do things 100% of the time. And nevertheless, the question does include, it says manifests itself in the imperfect ability to listen. And that's where it's so important that our assessors are assuring that they're using multiple measures, multiple observations through the multidisciplinary team process to ensure that in fact are those features noted to a degree that it's significant for which to say that the child has a disability. Here you have listed here the weaknesses and associated deficits. What is a specific learning disability? Again, here you see the listed academic areas. So for those of you who are thinking about that pre-referral process, this is why it's so important whether you call them multidisciplinary student success teams, multidisciplinary student study teams, RTI teams. Those teams are so important because what we would hope is that iterative cycles of interventions, supports, assistive technology, identifying the needs of the individual child have been identified already, so that when we walk into the assessment process, we have data specific to the area for which the child is wanting to be assessed or the team wants them to be assessed. So when we consider as assessors, we need to know from the onset, what is the area of suspected disability? So if that referral team can provide data to where it is specifically, and that's why it's so important that interventions, are targeted specifically to the specific areas where we want to engage in further and deeper assessment, knowing that the child is receiving interventions in those areas already, for which again there are concerns. That second prong, as I mentioned, is a severe discrepancy or pattern of strength and weaknesses in a related processing disorder. And it can be one or more of the following areas as you see there on the definition. So again, as we can see there, what it is, in as much as what it isn't. And it's very important. I share this with you, and I hope that you also take this to your general education friends. If you yourself are not a general educator, your student study teams, that your teams are well aware of what disability categories are and aren't is equally important, because that will also support the interventions that students receive and not bypass the intervention process that may go quickly to referral. Earlier, you saw what we call a SPED referral wheel, and you saw the little arrows. And we recognize that sometimes referrals are made very quickly with maybe some little minimal interventions. And that is a concern, as we want to ensure that students receive, as we said, tier 1 basic core, which is comprehensive ELD, and then a layering of supports and services as needed, as we know that special education is outside of those tiers of intervention. So consider your tier 1, your tier 2, tier 3 interventions, where special education is outside of those tiers, where again, we are acknowledging that if a student it does in fact have a disability, it is very targeted in relation to those services. So specifically to note here, a learning disability is not due to limited English proficiency. You'll also see there the Code of Regulations, which indicates again that the normal process of English language development, as well as manifestations of dialects, social linguistic variants, shall not may not, but shall not be diagnosed as a disabling condition. So again, we go back to the importance of that graphic and speaking to teams together as they review language difference versus disability, because sometimes there are some assumptions, perhaps some biases that are brought to the table by team members, as we do have difficulties again with this intersection. It's very difficult to look at each need, the English language proficiency need, the disability category, what is a suspected disability, because there are many overlaps, but it is our responsibility as assessment teams to disentangle that, to identify again, is there in fact an underlying disability, which yes, may be also impacting the student's rate of progress and development of English language proficiency skills. So this is a referral wheel that I was suggesting and referencing earlier. So if you consider again the referral made by staff, the interventions that are targeted. So think back to that pre-referral flow chart and its subsequent resources as we consider again extrinsic factors, cultural, personal needs, as we think whole child, and then again as we consider what are the needs of the student. So pre-referral and activities and interventions should have occurred. Nevertheless, I want to be clear that yes, parents, guardians, school members may refer directly to special education at any time. Our intent is not to hold up the referral process, but rather to ensure that students are receiving what they need to be successful prior to making any assumptions that the child has in fact a disability. Do know if you're a general educator, once that referral is made to special education, an assessment plan must be developed within 15 days of receipt of that referral. And then likewise, when the parent consents to that assessment plan, the assessment will begin and then an IEP will be held within 60 days. That IEP team is crucial to then determining together, not solely the school psychologist or the speech pathologist, but together as an IEP team, does the child in fact qualify for special education services based on an eligible disability category. So as we think of this segment, now we're making some assumptions that there were tiers of intervention, that there is a suspected disability, and now we're walking into assessment. But before we can assess, we're going to consider the assessment plan. But before I go further, we're going to launch a poll. So the question here in the poll is it true that schools or student study teams must wait and to have a student receive EL services maybe 4 to 6 years, or at least till 5th grade, so that the child can fully develop English language skills before being referred for special education? So think about maybe your written or unwritten policies that exist within your respective school site and district. And true or false, and it's okay to say I'm not sure. So we'll wait for the poll. True or false, must we wait? And the poll says, I think we're still getting some responses, so thank you everyone for responding. And I'm going to jump to the answer. And the answer itself is false. The answer itself is false. We don't have an obligation to wait, although we'd want to ensure that students have received English language development, that students are having access to comprehensive and integrated and designated ELD. So when we think of the full package of core Tier 1 supports, integrated ELD, so across content areas, designated, dedicated time for ELD standards and the support that students need to develop English language proficiency, that's occurring as a step 1, as their tier basic core services. However, there may be times again where in conjunction with tiers of support, there are significant needs, that the team itself has highlighted needs and supports of the child for which they do refer for special education. It's the responsibility now of the assessors then to ensure that the assessments are culturally and linguistically appropriate, that they have had training and support if they are not bilingual themselves, to then conduct an assessment that assures that this is not a language difference issue, but in fact it is a disability. And that's where we're headed to next, starting specifically again with our responsibilities. So again, the state statutes, the federal requirements, and IDEA, ensuring that our assessments are in fact valid, that they are comprehensive, linguistically and culturally appropriate. And that all starts with the development of the assessment plan. But it's important to note that as that assessment plan is being developed, we have to be forward thinking in, again, what are the assessments we're going to conduct? How are we going to conduct those assessments so that from the onset, we're thinking craftfully of how are we going to engage with the student to ensure culturally and linguistically responsive assessments. So you'll hear the requirement. Assessments are administered in a child's native language or other mode of communication and in the form most likely to yield accurate information. And again, as with all tests, all assessments that we provide, we want accurate information. Without accurate information, we're making inaccurate decisions. So we want to know what students can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. It does say at the very end, unless it's clearly not feasible to do so. So that's our last resort. We want to focus on accuracy, giving students voice and ensuring that we again are incorporating their native language, primary language, in assessment practices and policies. So I'm going to go forward with that with what is our first best option. And I know that there's probably questions in the chat box coming through with, well, if I don't speak that child's language, how about if, and these questions are probably stirring in your mind about cross-cultural and non-discriminatory evaluations. So yes, we want to ensure that we are assessing students in their primary language. Our first response, though, as we think of the assessment tools is yes, we will be assessing in English. We will, because we also want to be able to compare and correlate our information. So as we assess in English, we will find that the child may have deficits in certain areas, for then which we can target those deficit areas and assess then in their primary language. Because then we will know if it is truly a disability, it will exist both in the primary language and in English. For then again, we have deeper understanding about the student's learning and processing skills. So as we look at assessments, again, we assess the student in the primary language, and then again, suspected areas of weakness. You will see there that the encouragement is that we always utilize fully bilingual assessors. And I know that that's difficult out in the field, as many of you may be serving in communities where there are multiple languages, even in one respective classroom, multiple languages, and perhaps even dialects within languages. And we understand that that's true. Again, our focus and our requirement is that we're again ensuring that when we consider dialect, social linguistic variance, when we think of bilingualism, that we know from the onset that that in and of itself is not a disability. And unfortunately, we call it out because there are times when perhaps students are referred for special education, and that is, again, the driving force is the English language development or the lack thereof for which we are referring students. But we want to be sure that through the assessment process, we truly are assessing not solely language development. We have that information. We want to now know if it's in fact a disability. So this is a lot of ed code again to keep us in alignment with the requirements for which we must serve. But what does that really mean? That when it translates into the assessment plan, so again, from the onset of this beginning, when we're going to speak about assessments, that our assessors are very clear on what are the assessments they're going to administer, what primary language assessments are they going to administer as well, or bilingual assessments? Is the assessor bilingual? So when we ask that, it may be that the bilingual assessor is bilingual. So I can say I was a bilingual school psychologist at one time, but I wasn't bilingual in every single language represented. So as much as I feel very comfortable administering assessments in Spanish, that doesn't mean that I would then feel comfortable assessing in another language that I'm not fluent in. So as administrators, we also suggest and encourage, if you will, that your assessors clearly feel supported and that they know where to turn to should they need someone to interpret during their assessments. So just because they themselves are not fully bilingual, we're not going to then just default to nonverbal assessments or English-only assessments, but rather seek the resources that we need. And that's why I say it starts with the assessment plan. Because as the assessment plan is being developed, assessors can already contact their administrators or who they need to access to plan ahead for having that interpreter present to assist and support during the assessment process. As we all know, no one measure will again provide us with everything that we need, and it includes lots of observations and assessments and multimodalities, as we again want to ensure that students are assessed fully, but not without parent consent. So very important to note that we cannot move forward with the assessment process without the parent's consent to that assessment plan. So the clearer that that assessment plan is, again, that it's given to the parent in their primary language so that they have meaningful engagement, they fully understand the assessments that are being conducted and why. So that way we walk into the assessment process together as a team, gathering information and being supportive of one another. So here you see here again, the California Code of Regulations has specific language, again reminding us that our assessments must be conducted in primary language, that we take into consideration child's proficiency in their language, that we take that data into consideration as part of the assessment process to ensure, again, that the assessment plan, in as much as the assessment process, is void of any cultural, linguistic biases that may yield then inaccurate data. The nice thing about the California Practitioner's Guide is you have several resources. And these resources are also supplements, if you will, to the pre-referral process. So if they were completed early on in the pre-referral process, that may again lessen inappropriate referrals, but also support you should you not have this information. So I know that there are scenarios where you find that maybe there wasn't a fully thorough cumulative file check conducted, or perhaps extrinsic factors were not yet conducted, or those deeper questions to engage with families. You may want to know what the intervention summary is. So these tools, although we'd hope they'd occur through the pre-referral and referral process, you may find that they're useful tools to support you as you engage in the assessment process once that assessment plan is completed. I specifically want to highlight 4.3 here, the English Learner Student Questionnaire language use. And that one, again, they are all in your Padlet for you to use, but that's a great resource, especially to assist you as you begin to build rapport with the student. As you want to identify the language that they speak most comfortably in, and I say comfortably because as you build rapport with the children whom you're assessing, you may find that as they get comfortable with you, as you have conversations, especially if you're a bilingual assessor, they may just freely and comfortably now speak in their primary language. And that gives you an idea and some clues of how you might want to organize your assessment tools, what assessments you want to administer first. Again, as rapport is just as important as, again, having that fidelity to your assessments. So the English Learner Questionnaire, again, might be a useful tool as you begin on this journey of assessment with your students. As assessors, this part might be repeat for our EL specialists, for our teachers, for our general education practitioners, but our special educators as well, and specifically our assessors. The more that we become informed regarding the LPAC, so the student's particular English language proficiency skills, will also help us in the selection of the battery of tests that we're going to administer. So as we think of the domains of the English language proficiency assessment, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, that again will give us an entry point to understand, again, how the student communicates, the types of skills that the student already carries, so that as we're assessing, we're also looking at those areas that we already see deficits in, and maybe take a deeper dive into those areas first. We also have a better understanding of how the student communicates so that when we are listening and learning from the student during the assessment process, we're also then, again, constantly balancing, is this language difference or is this disability? Maybe I need to conduct further assessments. As we also then later speak to writing those assessment reports, we also would like, and not that we like, it's required that we reference not only the LPAC scores, but again, these definitions of what that means for the student. This might also help you later in your recommendations, because if in fact you find that the student is not eligible for special education, we definitely want to overhaul and go back to basics and identify, has a student truly received comprehensive ELD services, and that we fully understand where the student is in this trajectory of building language skills, not only by domain, but in its totality, so that students are supported and given what they need as way of targeted interventions. So language of assessment options comes up frequently because you may say, yes, I understand that the student's LPAC score is maybe a 1, maybe a 2, 3, where they need more context clues and supports as they're developing and bridging into English language proficiency skills, and where maybe the assessor is not fully bilingual in that child's primary language. We want to know what our options are. As I mentioned before, having a trained interpreter would be helpful. Not to be mistaken with a court-level interpreter or having a certification. That is not required by Ed Code, but rather that the interpreter is fluent in that child's primary language. Some districts have assessment tools that they provide their employees to determine levels of proficiency to ensure they are fluent and can be interpreters for you. The important part there, though, in this second option that you see, is that the interpreter that's supporting you as the assessor truly understands the assessments for which you are administering. What is the assessment, why it's being administered, and that they have opportunities to prepare. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to that in a little bit because I know the third option is there glaring at you as well as the fourth. So when we look at the third option, the interpreter again is being utilized and the interpreter speaks the primary language of the student. However, in this particular scenario, there may be limitations where certain words, a certain dialect, the interpreter is not able to translate those terms, dialects, themes, perhaps, in accordance with the script of the assessment, the standardized tool that we're administering. So for that reason, we are gathering data, we're gathering observations, information, but we may not be able to use the standardized score from those assessments, but rather more so use the information and data as demonstrating strengths and weaknesses given the information that we've collected. The fourth option, again, is that last resort when we use nonverbal assessments. And what I've seen many in the field do, and which I did in my own practice, was I would administer assessments in English, in Spanish, and then also pull in a nonverbal assessment because we want to, again, find these correlations. Is this truly a disability across? And wanting to ensure that, again, we're not defaulting or somehow missing something. That again, is this language difference? Is this truly a disability? And that is, again, a soft and hard balance for many of us, depending again on the situation. So if in fact you need to use an interpreter, here's a quick checklist to assist you. As again, assessors, as practitioners, because it not only is your school psychologist, as I mentioned, it might be your speech pathologist, your occupational therapist, your APE specialist, your PT, your teacher, your EL specialist. We truly are speaking to multidisciplinary teams given the needs of suspected disability for that child. So here again is just a checklist that might help you as you consider from the administrator lens. Again, I want you to be thinking about, do all of my assessors have an understanding of who the interpreters are that are accessible to them? Do we have interpreters in every language that's represented? If we don't, what are our next steps? Have we considered perhaps family members, community members, who is in their faith-based community, who could perhaps assist our school community with translations, interpretation of information, so that again, we have a robust pool of data for then the professionals and practitioners to then utilize, interpret that information to then conclude, is this a disability or not? So wherever possible, find the interpreter that you need, but prepare. We want to ensure that our interpreters fully understand that we need them to directly translate the information, and if not, that we understand that. And then equally, if again, students say other terms, other phrases as part of the assessment process, that they document that for us, because we need that wealth of information in order to have a successful debrief time. So pad some debrief time, and I know 60 days goes by really fast when you have multiple assessments that you're conducting. But that debrief time is very important because the interpreter may have picked up on more than what you understood, or maybe you saw some body language and you wanted to ask, well, what did the child say exactly at that moment? That also might cue you to then conduct further assessments or ask deeper questions in informal or formal ways. So as we consider the assessment of English learners, it also comes down to the tools that are at your disposal as assessors. And administrators may want to go back and take an inventory of what assessment tools are available to our assessors so that, again, from the onset, we walk into assessments utilizing the right assessment tools given the areas of suspected disability. So this Appendix 4.1, it's not an exhaustive list, but it is a list available to you all with different assessments, again, given different areas of needed assessment for that you could utilize. We always love to hear in the chat box if you know of other tools that aren't listed on this list in other languages. We love to hear it because we have been wanting to update the list again so that it serves you all in your community the best possible. So if you want to refer again to 4.1, although again not an exhaustive list, it is a pretty robust list that can give you some insight of maybe I'm missing an assessment, or talking to your administrators, and asking your administrator, can we purchase this? Do we have the resource and funds to add to our repertoire of assessments? Because maybe we've been sharing assessment kits amongst school sites, amongst assessors, and that has also delayed the assessment timelines, the processes, so on and so forth. So again, this is just another reference tool to assist you in your practice. So we have yet another poll question on this one. And the question is, may the parent waive this requirement for the student to be assessed for special education services in the student's primary language? So I've been talking all about needing to use an interpreter and ensuring primary language assessment, but can a parent waive this requirement? Let's go ahead and open that poll. We'd love to hear from you, and it's okay to say, I'm not sure. So is this a true statement? Can the parent say, no, it's okay, you don't have to do that? We see lots of responses coming in. Your best guess, may the parent waive it? And again, you're welcome to use the chat too. We always love to hear the types of scenarios that you're encountering out in the field. Okay, let's see, what are the polls saying now? Okay, about 45% are saying false. Parents can't waive this requirement. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and stop the poll. And those who said no, who said this is false, you all are correct. It is false. We have an ethical obligation to ensure that students are fully and comprehensively assessed. In as much as, yes, it might be easier to conduct a full assessment utilizing, again, assessments in English. We have the student study team, the referral team saying there are gaps in learning, there are deep concerns. Whatever those referrals, again, are coming to your table with, we have an obligation to do that deeper work, to fully assess in the student's primary language as well as English, so that we understand that the information we're gathering is in fact accurate. And accuracy, again, validity, comprehensiveness, reliability is so important. So as you pull together from the onset, as I mentioned, the development of your assessment plan, as you're gathering assessments, use of interpreters, that again, you're having this process going on as you score those scores, and maybe you reach that ceiling really high and you go to the next assessment. It really is dependent on the student. So although a parent may say, it's okay, maybe my child's US born and my child has had all of their years in the US coming to school, it's okay, go ahead and assess in English. If we know again that the primary languages other than English, we have a respective responsibility to assess in that primary language. And yes, there is that last resource of use of nonverbal assessments and observations. We want to be ensuring that even so, if we use nonverbal assessments and observations solely, for whatever reason, because we don't have assessment instruments in that dialect or interpreters in that dialect, we still have a culturally and linguistically obligation to ensure that, again, we're not allowing any of our own biases, perhaps, to cloud the accuracy of the assessment and the data, as we have a responsibility for non-discriminatory evaluation. So instruments used must be valid for the purpose in question. So we know what the assessments are for, how they're standardized, and yet we know that certain populations have not been in the standardization pool of our assessments. We know that, and I'll speak a little bit more to that when we get to the report writing aspect. But again, we're ensuring that we are reflecting multiple measures and that we're not solely basing it on one sensory limitation or limited English proficiency or fluency in and of itself, but we are comprehensively assessing. So when we consider, again, all from preschoolers, 'cause as we know in special education, we have a responsibility to assess students. Some of you may also work in programs for students on an IFSP, infant toddlers, but it's about at preschool. At preschool, at age 3, we then again are looking at English language proficiency. We're engaging in extra measures as they transition then to kinder and to school age programs. But all throughout these assessment processes, we have an obligation. And through that obligation, we also want to ensure that multidisciplinary team approach. And we mentioned this throughout our sessions, as again, when it comes to the needs of English learners, it's not solely a special education aspect or need or concern. It's all of us working together to leverage our collective experiences and again, our expertise. Because as assessors, we will want to ask that English language development teacher, so the teacher that serves in the capacity of providing designated ELD to the child, will have specific questions and want to conduct observations in that environment, as we then also conduct observations in social settings and in other academic areas where there are concerns or needs. Because again, the more robust that we are, we're able to make sound decisions. So as we use various assessment measures, again, you are selecting the right tools for the right assessment given that area of suspected disability. So whether you're providing norm reference, criterion, systematic observations across and around school settings, the structured interviews with teacher, student, parent, guardian, and bring all of that information together, we also want to acknowledge as assessors that we as assessors are being sensitive to the language, the cultural, specific factors of the whole child. So when we think back to that pre-referral form, we're again looking at all of those factors, any extrinsic basic needs that the child has those been met? We then look at personal and cultural factors, again, as multilingual learners are a varied population of different cultural and background that we want to be sensitive to and respective of, as well as their language skills, again, as an asset and a skill, and have we highlighted the skills that the child has, as we are also trying to investigate and identify where deficits exist, if any. So as we engage in those practices, these particular tools might be supportive to your work as well. All of these tools, I think we've mentioned before, are downloadable and fillable when you access them from the Padlet and or Imperial County SELPA website. You can download them and use them, rebrand them with your logo as you see appropriate. Again, that many experts went into the development of the California Practitioner's Guide, and we hope that you find these as useful tools in your practice. So the first one is 4.2, a parent questionnaire, to again assist you with gathering as much information from parents and guardians. And we often say, who knows their child best? The parent guardian, where they're able to share with us again, as they may also have seen concerns in the learning. They may also be able to explain whether they've seen or not seen any deficits or delays in the primary language, again, to further help us with understanding maybe some of the difficulties and challenges a student is having now. And then the English Learner Teacher Questionnaire, very important as we gather information from the teachers who directly serve the child. That's very important to us because in as much as we want to know the interventions, how are those interventions working, has the student made progress and in what areas, and that we assess specifically in the areas where we need data. The next one on 4.6 is the English language classroom observation checklist, as well as a focused observation checklist, and then 4.8 is a parent report. As again, the more information, it is titled for IEP development, and yes, we are developing an IEP, but do note through the assessment process, we may be developing an IEP that leads us to say the child is not eligible for special education. That is part of the process. Sometimes there is a misconception that the child was referred because there are so many gaps in practices, or the gaps in learning are so large, the child must be eligible for special education. It is an IEP team decision for which, again, we need all of the data at our disposal to make a sound, comprehensive decision. So as assessors, we're constantly thinking in our mind, is this valid? Is this reliable? Have I conducted a comprehensive assessment? Have I assessed in all areas of suspected disability? So no stone unturned. I've heard that term before, where that we're constantly looking at our own practice and using those 60 days fully to then assess, to perhaps even pull in additional assessments, subtests, observations, further interviews, to again bring us all the information that we need to indicate, is this truly a deficit? Does this deficit negatively impact the student's progress towards general education curriculum and standards, and specifically also the involvement of the English language development standards? Because that again will give us clues to what the student has received or perhaps what they haven't received. Through the assessment process, we may find that there are students who have not had access to those ELD standards, where their teachers perhaps have not fully utilized the ELA ELD framework to support again the student's development of English language proficiency, for which we then again would refer you back to that pre-referral flowchart that has some prompting questions that you might ask, as again, we're not in the business to necessarily change or fix students, but to support our staff so that they can deeply support the students in being successful. So taking that into consideration is very important. So what are the minimum requirements? This question always comes up. What is the minimum requirement that I have to do in an assessment, whether because we're concerned with acquiring interpreters or because the 60-day timeline ticks very, very fast, as I know it does. But when we think about, again, minimum requirements in the assessment report. So again, forward thinking, what assessment tools am I gathering through the assessment plan, what I'm doing through the assessment process, and then everything I need to ensure that I'm meeting these facets when I write my report, that I'm not void of data that is necessary and required, given again the education code, the state and federal mandates as required during the assessment process. So here you can see them all listed there. You'll see there in bold on item G, a determination concerning the effects of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage where appropriate. Because that's not to say that all English learners have environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage in their life. Again, it's a varied group of students where we need to acknowledge the individual student and assess the individual's needs, and again, where there are gaps and where there are deficits, should there be any. Because only with, again, that accurate data are we able to make determinations if, in fact, specialized services are needed above and beyond those tiers of intervention, because we are assuming that during the 60-day window of assessment processes, that students are continuing to receive their basic core services of EL services, tier 1 interventions, tier 2, tier 3 interventions, possibly as perhaps, not all, but perhaps there may be other social emotional, behavioral interventions that are needed by the child during the course of the assessment process. So we're not dropping all of the interventions during the assessment process. We would anticipate that everything would continue in support of the child as we conduct our assessments prior to determining eligibility. So best practices for assessment and evaluation reports. So we're going to get into this part in this next segment. I'm not sure if we're close to a break. Okay, I still have 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and capture this and then we'll give you a break because I know Zoom fatigue is real. But let's talk about assessment practices for your evaluation reports. So this is taking into consideration that I've utilized assessment tools, that I have either conducted assessments as a bilingual assessor, or I have used an interpreter to assist me in those areas where I assessed in English and deficits were found, for then which we assessed in the child's primary language to determine if those deficits also exist in the primary language as well as in English. That again gives us information that we're able then to make determinations. Perhaps, yes, we also utilize nonverbal assessments where necessary to further inform our practice. In addition to the multiple observations, and I know I sound like a broken record, but this is part of the process, that we are truly comprehensive in our assessment practices. So why? Because we need to be able to identify and define these prongs. What was the impact of language, cultural, environmental, and economic factors in learning, if any? So that we clearly state that in our assessment. How were the standardized tests and techniques altered, if they were altered? So perhaps if you recall in that second and third prong where we used an interpreter to assist us with assessments, it may be that again, because the assessment itself has differing language because of dialect and language, where certain terms may have not been translatable clearly, it's not a direct translation, where some interpretation occurred, if you will. And in those senses, we may have altered then the standardization of that tool, for which then we're using the data in a different way. We need to be clear on that. Again, where we use translators, translations, we're going to indicate a statement of that to again indicate validity and reliability. So I'm going to pause right there. Because our use of interpreters does support our practice. As assessors, however, we want to be clear though that when we conducted the assessment, the results that we garnered and gleaned from that information, that it's valid and reliable. So having said that, there may be times when assessment reports say things like, interpret with caution. The validity of this assessment may have been, we're going to be very careful and not say those terms because we have a responsibility to engage in valid and reliable assessments. However, we may need to say that, yes, a contributory factor, a need of the student is that they are second language learners. We may want to further explain that information, and we might say again that it contributes to the difficulties they're having, but if in fact there's a disability, the primary reason is the disability. So we're taking all of that into consideration. If you yourself are a bilingual assessor, we want to be very clear in your assessment report that you yourself were a bilingual assessor and that you administered the assessments. And for that reason, again, were there any effects on the results of the assessments? And you may put some anecdotal data there where these particular assessments were assessed without deviation from the standardization. Whereas these other assessments or these observations or the gathering again of criterion information, whatever that assessment is, where there may have been some deviation or where again you want to explain other commentary that was shared by the parent guardian, by the teacher, by the student. Again, as you're trying to explain what the process looked like from the onset to again now what you're interpreting as a result of the assessments that you have. So with that, before we go into a self-assessment and review those prongs, let's go ahead and take a break. So we're going to give you a 10-minute break and we'll see you back. If you have any questions in the chat box, I will come over to the chat box and I'll start looking at your questions. And then I'll come back after the 10 minutes and recap any of those questions. Thanks so much. We hope you took a break, gave yourself some time as we come back to the topic of assessment. So just to recap on some of the questions that were in the chat box, and there were some really great questions, and specifically, let's go back to the use of an interpreter. So there was a question about, does it have to be a certified interpreter? So there's no Ed code language that specifically says the level or skill that an interpreter has to have. However, again, given your respective district, if they want to hire court-level trained certified interpreters, you can do so. However, that's not required. Some districts, as I mentioned before, may have an assessment process of individuals as they sign up to be interpreters so that you know their skill level in that language where they are indicating they're fluent, so that you have a list of interpreters for Spanish, Chaldean, Vietnamese, again, the array of languages that are represented in your community. As I also noted that when we are using observations and interviews and non-standardized assessment tools, it may be that we also use the support of interpreters within the family. So family that can translate, maybe it is individuals from their faith-based group, their community. They can again assist us with gathering information from the parent guardian and the student if again we see that we need a deeper level of information. Because the more information that we have available to us, we will make more sound decisions. Given that process, though, there was a great question in the chat box, and really it resonated with us about where do I get started? So when we think about our systems in their totality, some of you may be feeling reassured, which I hope, and saying we have assessment practices, and pre-assessment, we have sound pre-referral practices where students are receiving supports, where when we know an assessment, a child is referred for assessment, it is with good due reason that we've tried interventions and there are significant concerns. But absent that, we would be remiss to say that we all live in perfect sound systems. We acknowledge that some difficult conversations may need to occur as you disrupt your system, as you think back to who are your leadership team members. And again, leadership teams should be those multidisciplinary teams where we're thinking about, again, who are those that impact change in your district. And that may be you in this session, or that may be you thinking about, I need to speak to my administrator. I need to speak to the lead teacher of that student study. I need to speak to the EL coach, the EL TOSA. I need to speak to the special education director so that they can bring together, again, those leaders to help us refine our process. Because we know and understand that across the state of California, many of you are having conversations about, are we over-identifying English learners as having disabilities? Are we over-referring English learners to this assessment process? Are we then gathering in IEP teams and perhaps pushing team members to make decisions about students that maybe doesn't sit well in our gut, that in fact, again, the student is not eligible for special education? And these referrals are well-intended, and I know that because we want to do what's right for our students. But special education, again, is a service. It's a support for students with identified disabilities. It's not a place either. So it's not to say that general ed is here and the student is going to leave to somewhere else. The child can easily receive specialized academic instruction in that general education environment, receive accommodations and/or modifications. So as we think of what does our system look like today, it may require that you pull certain data points, that your district goes back and analyzes how many English learners have been referred for special education and why. Of those students who were referred, how many were in fact eligible? In what disability categories were they eligible? As we dig deeper with the session today and in the assessment tool we're going to use in a little bit, it's going to give you a tool to also then help you look at the data within those psychoeducational assessment reports, the speech and language reports, those multidisciplinary team reports that you have at your district, at your school site, to look at each of these prongs that are indicated in Ed Code to find out, have we used best practices in ensuring culture and linguistically appropriate assessments for English learners? Because again, our assessments need to be valid, comprehensive, and reliable so that the data, again, is interpreted with fidelity. And again, we're making decisions that are appropriate for students. Is this an easy task? Since the information you heard this morning, we know that it's not. It may take, again, responsive people like yourself, committed practitioners in the field who are willing to take that next step and perhaps disrupt the system a little bit or refine the practices. We also encourage you to consider, again, what are your policies and what are your practices, whether written and unwritten? Because we may have a policy, we may understand the best practice, but it's important then to inquire, especially if you're at the district level, maybe county office level, where then you inquire, how do these steps actually take place in the moment? How are referrals made? How are assessments being conducted? Are we perhaps conducting assessments that are not robust and comprehensive? Those are all questions to ask, and it's okay. This is the time to say we can get better. We can refine, we can polish our skill, we can hone this activity so that, again, we can continue to move in a way that we progress and ensure that students receive what they need, that we are, again, taking into consideration all the skills and abilities that our English learners bring, highlight those skills and abilities while also ensuring comprehensive assessments are occurring for those children who truly do have a suspected area of disability and perhaps a disability. I know today's conversation is all about initial assessments, and then our next session with you will be about IEPs. But as we think of this assessment process, I would be remiss to say that this is the same process, the same timeline, the same requirements for the fact that some teams may also be considering, is this child eligible for a 504 plan? We don't always touch upon that, but the assessment practices and the requirements are the same. That requirement to conduct a comprehensive assessment is the same, whether it's IEP or 504, because again, we're trying to get to the root and analyzing, does this child have a disability? The IEP team can then determine, is this disability, if any, is this disability significantly impacting, for which an IEP needs to be developed, or are there substantial effects where then perhaps a 504 is more appropriate, where the child would receive accommodations in the general ed environment. So that comes back to why this importance of really digging deeper into the assessment practices. So as assessors in this session, you may be considering, I need additional assessment tools. I need access to interpreters. Perhaps I need to rethink again the way that we have conducted assessments, or the types of questions that we've asked the referring team who felt that there was an area of suspected disability. That might arise from this thought process, and we hope that you are reflective on that. And the same is true. If you can sit back and feel reassured and said, yes, we have covered each of these prongs, then I thank you. I thank you, because again, then we know we are truly responsive to these kids that we serve. But here we have a self-assessment. So you may not have an assessment in front of you right now, but I do want to give you an opportunity to take some time to review this assessment. It is anonymous. Do know that it is anonymous. When you click on the link, it's going to open up this assessment here, assessment to establish eligibility for special education and related services, and they must meet all of the requirements that you see there. As you go through it, I would ask that you just click randomly, click yes or no on all of these assessments. You may also be thinking back to maybe the last assessment report that you read, maybe the last assessment report that you wrote, if you yourself are an assessor. This particular tool will also support our administrators as perhaps you engage as your next step in some random sampling of assessment reports to determine, were they comprehensive? Did they meet each of these prongs? So as you open it, we're going to give you about 10 minutes to review, because I would like you to read each of the prongs. Most importantly, though, as I mentioned, just click yes or no on each of the features, because it's very important that you get to the next page. If you don't answer one of the questions, it won't take you to the second page. And the second page of the self-assessment has about 5 questions that are specific and unique to the assessments of English learners. So we'll give you about 10 minutes to peruse that assessment. Okay, I think we're about ready. So you had an opportunity to review this particular self-assessment. So again, earlier in this session, we asked, who's here, given your respective role? As assessors reviewing the self-assessment, it may be easy for you to reflect on the last assessment report that you wrote. As administrators, this may be an opportunity for you to then later go back to your site and pull assessment reports so that you can review and then again note, are these assessments being conducted in a comprehensive manner for which they are culturally and linguistically appropriate for English learners? Likewise, if you are a staff member of your school site who sits in on the IEP, you should be able to listen and hear and know that these things are explicitly in that psychoeducational report, speech and language report, again, that multidisciplinary report that's being reviewed at the IEP. Because again, it should be explicit that this information is included in that evaluative report. So as you come together as an IEP team, this is training yourself, if you will, to identify or to ask questions during that IEP process. Because given your respective role on that IEP team, it is assumed that you have a knowledge base and understanding, and that you can use this information to make appropriate decisions as to where there is a disability or not. The decision of, is the child eligible for special education, doesn't solely rest on the assessor, but rather the dialogue that the IEP team has regarding the assessment results and how that assessor shares the interpretation of those results and standardized measures, non-standardized measures, observations, and so forth. So as we consider again each of these prongs in the assessment reports, I would encourage you to utilize this tool. You can copy it and reuse it. Again, it's completely anonymous. As you go back to your sites, if again this is an area of concern where perhaps you have been noticing or wondering, are our assessments actually comprehensive, culturally and linguistically appropriate and reliable? Through the assessment process, we also talked about trained, certified interpreters, trained or untrained. So as we consider again the use of interpreters, that also comes to the fact that there were some questions about, does this also apply to triennials as well as initial assessments? Yes, it does. So as you conduct, and you can use this particular tool again to look at your triennial evaluation assessments, because when a student is eligible for special education, they require a comprehensive assessment every 3 years to reestablish or redetermine if the child, in fact, the student, is eligible for special education services and supports. So you could use this particular tool for, again, if it's an initial or a triennial. The same is true for, now you might be thinking, I planted that seed, if you will, and you're thinking about 504s. The same requirements should be true of assessments that are conducted for 504s, where in fact we have these concerns regarding disability, where we have concerns again for appropriateness of assessment. Again, nevertheless, there are many other disability and other factors when we're considering 504. So I'm not going to deviate too much, again, because students may qualify for a 504 for other health conditions and related needs. But when we're considering that initial referral and that initial assessment, the more robust and comprehensive the assessment is, again, we're going to ensure that results are valid and reliable, and that we're meeting each of the prong of the requirements, the mandates, state and federal, that we are required to adhere to. So we're hoping again that this particular tool might be of use to you as you consider again, what are the assessments being conducted? How are they being conducted in our respective school site, district, county office? Maybe you're the supervisor of school psychologists, speech therapists, assessment teams. The same is true if you are on an IEP team as the LEA designee. This question often comes up where you may say, I'm a academic coordinator, I am the assistant principal, I am in any of these respective roles where you're sitting in the IEP as the district's designee, having authority as you sign that IEP. Again, you'll want to ensure, because now this responsibility falls on you to ensure that, again, the practices that were conducted during that IEP, the conversations that were held, including, again, the information that was imparted from the assessors, that it is valid and reliable for us to make a valid and reliable decision as to whether the student, in fact, has a disability. So again, that's one resource that might be of assistance to you in this process. And these are some guiding questions, because we would highly encourage that you take this information back to your district. You may be participating today as part of a multidisciplinary team, or you might be thinking, this might be a good opportunity to work with our assessment teams for our next staff development, as we perhaps pull some random samples of assessment reports. So these are some questions that you could have as guiding questions in your teams. So based on your experience, have all the elements been addressed in the reports, whether you're the listener or the writer of the reports, the participant in the IEP? And B there is very important. And someone said, how do we change up the system? How do we change practices? And these are the questions that we would want to answer truthfully and respectively in order to make change. What are some obstacles that may have kept the assessor from meeting each element in assessment practices and reflected in their reports? You may think about what are some obstacles. If you feel willing to engage, be transparent, we'd love to hear in the chat box, what are some obstacles that maybe you have noticed in your system as to perhaps why assessments haven't been as comprehensive or reliable as you would have liked them to be, to then make informed decisions. And then how might you ensure moving forward? Because this is the important piece. We want to move forward. We all want to engage in appropriate practices so that students, again, are honored, that we are using assessments that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. So what might be your next steps? So if you'd like to share your next steps in the chat, again, we love to hear your reflections. It's always nice to see from each other what your responses are in the chat box as we collaborate in these spaces. So even though we may be very far away from each other, through this platform, we're able to engage and acknowledge again what some promising practices are, perhaps where refinements need to be made, and how we can move forward together as a community of practice across the state of California. So our next activity, and though it says future teamwork, because yes, I want you to take it back to your school site, we'll have an opportunity now to engage with this activity. So the next activity that you're going to engage in is a student scenario. Every chapter has student scenarios. So if you're thinking back to chapter 3 in the pre-referral process, you might want to access that particular scenario as well, as it gives guidance of hypothetical teams, the interventions that were utilized. And in this scenario, in this particular chapter, it's about a little girl named Cruz. So Cruzita, and again, her obstacles and challenges as an English learner, was referred for special education assessment. If you take this activity back to your group, here are some instructions that you would engage in. Today, we're not going to enter into any breakout rooms because I'd like you to review it independently. As you review it independently, however, I want you to think and look and reflect how the practices that they engaged in this hypothetical scenario, how well and how closely does it match the practices that are utilized at your respective school site, district, or if you supervise multiple districts, how closely does it align? And what further questions do you have as a result of it? So here are some guiding questions as you independently review the scenario of Cruz. Identify best practices. Are there additional assessments you would administer? So if you're an assessor, you may think of additional assessments that you felt were necessary to fully build that comprehensive assessment. Is there additional information you would feel necessary to ensure that Cruz's assessment is valid and comprehensive, given her respective cultural and linguistic background? Again, knowing that English learners, varied group of students having different needs, skills, and abilities. So given this scenario of Cruz, we'd like you to walk through these questions, and as I mentioned also, be reflective of how these processes match or maybe don't fully match the practices that occur in your respective district. So let's give you 10 minutes again, as this is a rather long scenario. Please flood the chat box with any questions that you might have. And again, review the scenario of Cruz independently for about 10 minutes, and I'll be checking the chat box for any questions. Thank you. So I hope you had an opportunity to again think, reflect, and ponder. There were some great questions in the chat box. I wanted to highlight, I think there was a question alluding to perhaps domain exemptions, as that was a question, and I think that will take us to our IEP segment, which is the follow-up to this particular session. But because it came up, I just want to be very clear is that during the comprehensive assessment processes, we do use primary language assessments as part of that process. Again, last resort may be that nonverbal assessments are being used, or nonverbal assessments are using in conjunction with assessments in the primary language. In the scenario of Cruz, so maybe even prior to referral, the team had some conversations. Only students who actually are eligible for special education services, so students who have a disability, an eligible disability category under IDA, may be considered to have a domain exemption on the LPAC. So you don't want to necessarily muddy the waters, but there was some questions about what if a parent made a mistake and the parent says, no, my child really doesn't have another primary language. The child uses 80% or 90% English. What that tells us is that the child does have another language other than English existing in their home and in their environment. Because what we do know is that based on the research, and this also applies to children who are verbal or nonverbal, because that question also comes up. If the child has been exposed to another language other than English, there has been some receptive skills. The child has been understanding and comprehending information in another language, and that's part of that child's full repertoire. So having said that, unless the child is actually reclassified, has gone through the reclassification process, and that team has determined that the child is now an RFEP, then only then would then we consider potentially not utilizing primary language assessments and tools. I myself would default to best practices, and I would still use primary language tools unless, again, the student is a clear 4, the child is fluent in all terms and aspects. And you may see in the scenario of Cruz. So someone had a question, well, what about more academic assessments in English? I absolutely would conduct assessments in both English and in Spanish, as I want to get a full understanding of all of the foundational skills that Cruz has in Spanish. And then I'd also have my assessments in English because I want to be able to look at them both distinctly. And again, when I'm considering that language difference versus disability, are there any red flags? Because if it truly is a disability, it's going to exist in the primary language as well, of course, as in English. So those are some things to consider. As I went through the chat box, there were also some questions again about 504s and things of that nature. And again, that assessment process, we want to be very comprehensive, of course, during the initial, but there are some other rules and parameters around the 504. Either way, if you're thinking about triennial, so you're jumping forward to the child who is in fact eligible for special education, again, we're going to want to ensure that the student is being considered, that we include, again, information regarding the primary language, as we include information regarding the student's achievement on the LPAC, given the 4 domains. Students on a 504 or an IEP, yes, may be exempt from a domain. However, if it directly relates to their given disability as noted in their respective plan. So it's not to say that we just automatically start domain exempting. The important thing to note, though, is that throughout this process, and should the child be eligible for special education, that child will retain Tier 1 core services, which include comprehensive ELD. And we want to be very clear on that. Because what we've also noticed is that sometimes in the field, students are then referred for special education, may be eligible for special education services and supports, and then somehow lose their basic core service of comprehensive, integrated, and designated ELD. As IEPs are developed for students who do in fact qualify for special education, the IEP also needs to ensure that linguistically appropriate goals and objectives are written, and those are based on the information that we have from our ELD standards, curriculum, tools, assessments, and resources, the LPAC data that we have available, the observations, the data that was reviewed by way of the academic measures and assessments. We continue to offer primary language supports and resources where appropriate, designed for that student. And then we'll further discuss accessibility tools. So do know that that's coming in our next session as we review section 3 during our next webinar together. So as I've shared much information, if you wouldn't mind in the chat box dropping a new learning and a wondering that you're still carrying with you, because I always want to ensure that we've answered your questions before you log off of any session. So as I move forward, take a moment, if you haven't already shared a new learning, an aha moment, something that resonated with you that maybe you're going to then follow up with your team at your respective school site or with, again, your leadership team. And then a wondering. Wonderings are important to us because, again, if you have questions, we want to ensure that you have the information that you need. And then likewise, you can always contact us. In addition, in the chat box, we did notice that some had logged in late. Do know that after today's session, we will send the recording out to all of the participants once it is archived on our website. We'll give you the link so that you can have access to any parts that you may have missed during the course of this session. And or if you'd like to replay it with respective staff members to use for further training purposes, you can always do that. And know that the Padlet is there for you. It's free, and all the resources, of course, that are on it. If you want to remake that Padlet feel free to do so. That way you have it archived, or just bookmark it, and that way anytime we refresh any of the tools on it, then you'll have the most refreshed and up-to-date tools. So go ahead and flood the chat box with new learnings and wonderings that you may have regarding the assessment process. We also have Chapter 4, which is an infographic of all of the concepts that I reviewed as part of Chapter 4 and then some. The infographics can be downloaded as blocks or as one long PDF. If you download it as a block, you could use those blocks as slides, if you will, so that you can then further share it with your assessment teams, share it with your IEP teams, your referral teams, so that again, you can use these for training practices, review, and support, so that you again can work amongst and within your system if this particular is an area of interest for your teams. We understand that different districts, sites, support staff may have different entry points to the California Practitioner's Guide, and for which we have sessions regarding each section of the Practitioner's Guide. This particular section in Chapter 4 dealing with all things assessment practices and ensuring comprehensive and valid assessments, so that students again are uniquely assessed as individuals, so that we can determine if the child in fact has a disability or not. You may have also heard about the CLIM, the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix. Many assessors in the field are using this. Dr. Samuel Ortiz, well-versed, knowledgeable, esteemed colleague. We do have a video on our website. If you didn't watch that video, I would highly recommend it, as he goes through the research. What I want to share is the CLIM required? It is not. Is the XPAS required? It is not. What is required is that assessors are again utilizing comprehensive, valid, and reliable assessment tools and practices, because without that, our data again is not accurate for the purpose for which we need it. Accurate data is what then builds tools such as the CLIM, where we can put accurate data and then identify if we need to conduct additional assessments, or if again the data is determining to us that this is an anomaly, or perhaps this is significantly determining that the child does in fact have a disability based on the statistics of it, if you will, and looking at those patterns of strengths and weaknesses that students demonstrate. But as we know, all of us, including myself, we all have relative strengths and weaknesses. Through the assessment process, we want to respectively understand, though, that as we all have relative strengths and weaknesses, are there deficits? Are there significant weaknesses that are impeding and affecting that child's ability to progress towards general education curriculum and standards, including progression on those ELD standards and development of English language proficiency because of a disability? I would highly encourage, again, this video. It is archived on our website, as well as a subsequent Q&A session with Dr. Ortiz, where he discusses not only the assessments that he uses, good practices, and report writing. On our website, we additionally have a separate Padlet, which we'll link into today's Padlet, which is all about assessments. So if you are an assessor, you may want to refer to that particular Padlet with more information about assessments. Oh, not the video. Let's keep moving forward. But before you leave us, we do want to visit our website so that you have direct access to all of the resources and more. But before we take you to our website, we would like for you to respond to our survey. Your feedback is very helpful for us as we continue to engage with practitioners across the state of California, so that we ensure that we meet your needs and provide you with some supports and next steps in the practice. So in the chat box, we will share with you the Survey Monkey in just a minute. We're going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to engage in that survey. If you could take some time on that. While you complete the survey, I will also be checking the chat box in case there have been some questions. And again, we thank you for your participation. You know that you can visit us at our website, and we're going to shift to our website in just a second so that we can navigate through where you may find some additional resources, because you may have additional questions about other topics as covered in the Practitioner's Guide that we may not have covered today during this session. So with that, I thank you all for participating. I think we ended a little bit earlier. The gift of time is always good. I will continue to monitor the chat for another 15 minutes before we log you all out. I never like to log out until the last friend logs out. I thank you wholeheartedly for your participation in our session today and our collective commitment to ensure that all students receive the supports that they need. We thank you again for your participation and feel free to reach out to us at any time. We hope to see you all log into section 3 as we continue to move through the series and each section of the California Practitioner's Guide. Thank you again, and we'll continue to man the chat. Thank you.